Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The shadows in this place have weight. That's what I've come to understand after 15 years working the graveyard shift at Meridian Industrial Supply. They aren't just absences of light. They're presences gathering in corners, stretching across concrete floors, and lately watching me. I first noticed it 3 weeks ago. Now I can't stop noticing it, and I can't shake the feeling that something has changed in the warehouse, or maybe something has changed in me. My name is Ray Carlson, and until recently I considered myself a rational man. The night shift suited me. Fewer people, fewer complications. I patrol the sprawling warehouse complex, check the loading bays, and monitor the security feeds. Simple work for decent pay. I've never been jumpy working alone in a 990,000-foot facility filled with stacks of lumber piping and construction materials. Teaches you to distinguish between the natural settling sounds of a building and anything that requires attention. But that night 3 weeks ago, something changed. It began as most shifts do, coffee and a thermos clipboard in hand. Flashlight on my belt. The night was unseasonably cold for September, and a thin fog had settled over the industrial park, diffusing the sodium lights outside into hazy orange globes. I made my first rounds, noting the chill that seemed to seep through my jacket. Despite the building's climate control, nothing unusual, just the typical creaks and groans of metal shelving. The distant of the HVAC system, the occasional scurrying of mice in the rafters. I was midway through my second patrol when I heard it. Footsteps, not the hollow metallic sounds of the building. Contracting but deliberate footfalls. The unmistakable sound of weight shifting from heel to toe. They echoed from the eastern corridor where we store specialty cement and insulation. Nobody should have been there at 2:17 a.m. My first thought was mundane, probably someone from the day shift who forgot something and came back. But I'd locked up myself, and the alarm system hadn't registered any entries since I'd arrived. My second thought was less comforting. Intruders looking to steal copper piping or power tools, items that regularly disappeared from construction sites in the area. I radioed in the security company that monitors our feeds remotely. The operator confirmed what I already knew. No entry alerts, no motion sensor trips. I should have been completely alone. The warehouse's layout is a grid of long straight corridors intersected by narrower aisles. The eastern section is poorly lit even during the day, with high shelving that creates deep caverns of shadow. As I approached, I switched on my heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Like a knife security. I called out my voice, sounding thinner than I intended. Identify yourself. The footsteps stopped. I swept my light down the corridor, illuminating stacks of pink insulation on one side and pallets of concrete mix on the other at the far end. Perhaps 60 feet away, my light caught something. A silhouette, motionless and dark. It stood perfectly still, its edges seeming to blur into the shadows behind it. I couldn't make out features, just a vaguely hum shape. Watching my heart hammered against my ribs as adrenaline surged through my system, I took a step forward, radio raised. "This is private property," I said, trying to sound authoritative. Despite the tremor in my voice, "Identify yourself, or I'm calling the police." The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as if considering me. I began walking toward it, flashlight beam fixed on the spot, though the light seemed to bend strangely around the silhouette, never quite illuminating it directly. My mouth went dry, and each step required more effort than the last, as if I were wading through invisible molasses when I was perhaps 20 feet away. The figure was simply gone, not like someone who ducked around a corner or ran. There was nowhere to run to. It was as if it had been absorbed into the darkness itself. I stood there, pulse throbbing in my temples as a cold sweat broke out across my back. I searched every aisle, every possible height in place. In that section, nothing. No doors had been opened, no windows breached. The building was secure. Later that night, I reviewed the security footage. What I saw didn't make sense. The cameras showed nothing in the corridor when I entered it. No silhouette, no intruder. but they did capture something else. Brief, almost subliminal distortions passing in front of each camera in sequence, like someone moving just fast enough to register as motion but not slow enough to be seen. Clearly, the timestamp showed these anomalies occurring throughout the building. Sometimes in areas I had just left, sometimes in areas I was about to enter. I convinced myself it was a technical glitch. Camera systems' malfunction sensors get triggered by changes in temperature or air pressure. There had to be a logical explanation, but then it happened again. 2 nights later, I was in the break room microwaving a frozen dinner when the fluorescent lights above me flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. The microwave digital display reset itself, blinking 12L, and I felt it a pressure change as if the air had suddenly become denser. The hair on my arm stood up, and I had the distinct visceral sensation of being watched slowly. I turned toward the doorway. Nothing was there, but the hallway beyond seemed darker than it should have been, as if the shadows had condensed into something more substantial. I abandoned my meal and spent the next hour checking every corner of the facility. Everything was secure. Everything was normal, and yet nothing felt normal anymore. Over the following weeks, the incidents escalated in frequency and intensity. I began finding objects move between my rounds. A clipboard left on one shelf would appear on another. Tools arranged in specific patterns that I didn't create. Once I returned to the security office to find every monitor displaying the same empty corridor, though I was certain I'd left them cycling through different areas. I started documenting everything, keeping a detailed log of times, locations, and sensations. The pattern that emerged was unsettling. The phenomena clustered around 3:15 a.m., focused initially in the eastern corridor but gradually spreading throughout the warehouse, and they always seemed to anticipate my movements occurring in areas shortly before I arrived. The physical manifestations of my fear became impossible to ignore. My resting heart rate increased. I developed insomnia that persisted. Even on my days off, I would jolt awake from half-remembered nightmares, convinced that a silhouette stood in the corner of my bedroom watching my appetite disappeared, and with it 15 pounds in 3 weeks. My supervisor noticed the change in me during a shift. Handover, he suggested I take some vacation time, commenting on the dark circles under my eyes, the way my hands trembled as I filled out the nightly report. I almost told him everything then about the footsteps, the silhouette, the displaced objects. But I could already imagine his reaction. He'd attribute it to stress or sleep deprivation. He might even suggest I seek professional help. Maybe I should have. Instead, I decided to confront whatever was happening. If something or someone was in the warehouse, I would find evidence. I brought in additional equipment from home, a digital audio recorder, a thermal imaging attachment for my phone, motion-activated trail cameras I'd once used for a brief hunting phase. I set them up in the eastern corridor and other hot spots I'd identified for 2 nights. Nothing happened. The warehouse was quiet. Normal. I began to wonder if my mind had manufactured the entire experience. If stress and isolation had finally caught up with me after years of nocturnal solitude. Then came last night. I was in the security office reviewing camera feeds when the power went out. The emergency lights kicked on, immediately bathing the corridors in a dim reddish glow. I grabbed my flashlight and radio following protocol to check the circuit breakers. The main breaker panel is located in the basement level, a sprawling concrete space mostly used for storage of outdated inventory and discarded fixtures. I'd always disliked going down there. The ceiling is low, the pathways narrow and twisting, but I'd never feared it. Until last night, as I descended the stairs, the beam of my flashlight seemed to penetrate less deeply into the darkness, as if the shadows had become thicker, more resistant. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step, my breath forming clouds in the increasingly frigid air. The silence was absolute. No hum of electricity, no distant traffic sounds penetrating from outside, just the sound of my boots on concrete and my increasingly shallow breathing. I reached the breaker panel and found it untouched. No trip circuits, no obvious cause for the outage. As I was examining it, my radio crackled to life through bursts of static. I heard what sounded like breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths, as if someone were standing very close to a transmitter. "This is Carlson," I said into the radio. "Who's there?" The breathing continued for several seconds, then stopped. The static cleared, and then I heard my own voice coming through the speaker repeating words I'd spoken earlier that night during a routine check-in, all clear in Section 4, moving to Section 5. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I switched off the radio, fighting the urge to run. I needed to return to the security office to check if anyone had entered the building during the blackout. That's when I heard the footsteps again. Not from the radio, but from somewhere in the basement. They were unhurried, deliberate, moving toward me. My flashlight flickered, dimmed, then brightened again. I swept its beam in the direction of the sound, illuminating stacks of old lumber, discarded display racks, and pallets of discontinued tile. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing then, a sound directly behind me. The soft scuff of a shoe on concrete. I spun around, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. My light caught something at the edge of its beam, that same dark silhouette now much closer than it had ever been before. Still featureless, still indistinct, but undeniably present. Fear paralyzed me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My light flickered again, and in that momentary darkness, I felt something cold brush against my cheek. Light as a breath, but deliberate as a caress. When the light stabilized, the silhouette was gone, but on the wall beside me where nothing had been. Before I saw a handprint not made of dust or dirt, but of absence, as if someone had pressed their palm against the concrete and somehow extracted all color and texture from that exact spot, leaving a perfect void in the shape of a hand. I don't remember running up the stairs, don't remember locking myself in the security office, but I remember the cameras coming back online one by one, each showing normal empty corridors, and I remember the timestamp on each feed, 3:15 a.m. I've called in sick today, the first time in 7 years. I'm sitting in my apartment with all the lights on, typing this account while the events are still fresh because I need to understand what's happening. Because I need someone to know the trail cameras and audio recorders are still in the warehouse, I should go back tonight to retrieve them to see if they captured anything. The rational part of me, the part that's shrinking by the hour, says there will be a logical explanation for everything. A prankster with access to the building, a malfunction in the electrical system. My own overtaxed imagination, but another part of me knows different because when I finally left the warehouse this morning as dawn broke over the industrial park, I checked my pockets for my car keys and found something else. Instead, a small, smooth stone I'd never seen before, and when I held it up to the light, I saw that it wasn't a stone at all, but a perfect cube of concrete. Its surface bearing the faint impression of fingerprints that don't match my own. I don't know what's waiting for me in that warehouse. I don't know if I'll go back tonight, but I know that whatever has been watching me from the shadows isn't just a figment of my imagination, and I know with growing certainty that it's been watching me for much longer than I've been aware of it. Perhaps it's been there all along in the peripheral shadows of my life, waiting for me to finally notice. And now that I have, it's noticed me too. The first time I heard the pipes, I convinced myself it was normal. New buildings settle. New plumbing has quirks, but there's nothing normal about what happens at 2 a.m. In my walls, I found the apartment listing 3 months ago during a desperate housing search. The photo showed gleaming hardwood floors, pristine white walls, and modern fixtures all recently renovated. According to the description, the price seemed suspiciously reasonable for such a prime location, but the landlord explained that he was eager to secure a long-term tenant after completing extensive renovations. Something about tax write-offs and avoiding vacancy when I toured the place. Everything checked out. The renovation was immaculate. New floors, threw out fresh paint, updated kitchen appliances, and completely redone bathroom plumbing. The landlord, Mr. Harmon, a thin man with perpetually damp palms, proudly detailed how he gutted the entire unit down to the studs he mentioned repeatedly, how he'd replaced everything that needed replacing. I remember finding the phrasing odd, but I was too enchanted by the apartment's spaciousness and natural light to dwell on it. I moved in on the 1st of February. For the initial 2 weeks, everything was perfect. I settled into a comfortable routine, enjoying the reliable water pressure and efficient heating system. System luxuries my previous apartment had sorely lacked. I even started sleeping better, no longer disturbed by the creaking floors and rattling windows of my old place. Then came the first night I heard it. I'd fallen asleep reading, only to jolt awake at exactly 2:03 a.m., according to my bedside clock. At first, I couldn't identify what had woken me. Then I heard it again. A distinct gurgling sound coming from inside the wall behind my headboard. It wasn't the normal sound of water running through pipes. This was different, irregular, almost rhythmic, like liquid being forced through a partially blocked passage. I pressed my ear against the wall. Tracking the sound, it seemed to move, flowing from one section of wall to another, traveling up, then horizontally, then down again. The path made no sense given the apartment's layout. I knew enough about basic PL to understand that water lines generally follow logical routes, straight lines connecting fixtures in the most direct way possible. This sound wandered like a maze. I checked every faucet on the toilet to ensure nothing was running or leaking. Everything was dry, perfect. Even I convinced myself it was probably the upstairs neighbor using water at an odd hour and went back to bed. But the next night at precisely 2:03 a.m., the same sound returned, and the night after that and the night after that, always at the same time, always 2:03 a.m., following the same irregular pattern through my walls, always lasting exactly 17 minutes before stopping as abruptly as it began. After a week of disrupted sleep, I contacted Mr. Harmon. His response was dismissive. Something about air trapped in the new pipes that would work itself out. Eventually, he seemed eager to end the conversation, reminding me how much money he'd spent on replacing everything that needed replacing. When I mentioned the precise timing of the sounds, his voice tightened. He suggested I was being overly sensitive to normal building noises. Perhaps I was, so I bought earplugs and tried to ignore it, but then came the tapping. It started 3 weeks into my tenancy. I'd pressed my ear against the wall, tracking the liquid sounds as had become my nightly ritual when I felt, rather than heard, a vibration, tap, 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 as if someone was gently knocking from the other side of the wall. I pulled away immediately, heart pounding, then cautiously placed my palm flat against the cool surface. The tapping came again, 3 distinct vibrations, precisely spaced, then silence. I told myself it was pipes, contracting or expanding, a common occurrence in buildings. Even new plumbing can make knocking sounds when H-water runs through cold pipes, but this didn't feel mechanical. It felt intentional. I spent the next day at work researching plumbing systems on my breaks, looking for rational explanations. That evening, I methodically inspected every inch of the apartment, tapping walls and listening for hollow spots that might indicate unusual spaces or non-standard construction. Everything seemed normal, which somehow made it worse. That night, I stayed awake until 2 a.m., sitting cross-legged on my bed, watching the wall when the gurgling began, right on schedule. I didn't just listen, I documented. I recorded the sounds on my phone, timed their duration, and mapped their apparent path through my apartment. On a crude floor plan I'd sketched, the pattern was consistent with previous nights, but seeing it visualized disturbed me deeply. The sounds traveled in a pattern that resembled a crude figure eight, looped through my bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, and living room walls. No plumbing system would be designed this way. When the tapping began, I tried something new. After the 3 taps concluded, I reached out and responded with 3 taps of my own. The silence that followed was heavier than any I'd experienced before. The gurgling stopped mid-flow for nearly a minute. Nothing happened. Then from deeper within the wall came 5 distinct taps, slow, deliberate, unmistakably responsive. My mouth went dry, my pulse hammered in my throat, sweat beat along my hairline. Despite the cool air, I couldn't move, couldn't blink, couldn't breathe. I'd been prepared for the sounds to be mechanical, or at worst from a neighbor's apartment carrying through the shared walls. I wasn't prepared for direct communication. I didn't tap back. Eventually, the gurgling resumed its pattern, completed its usual 17-minute cycle, and ceased. The next day, I called in sick to work and spent hours inspecting the building's exterior. I studied old photos of the property I found online, looking for clues about its original construction or any history that might explain what I was experiencing. The building was over 80 years old but had been well maintained throughout its life. Nothing in its documented history suggested anything unusual. I approached a neighbor across the hall, casually inquiring about their experience in the building. The elderly woman seemed confused by my questions about plumbing. Noises she'd lived there for 12 years and never heard anything unusual at night. Certainly nothing at such specific times. When I asked about the previous tenant of my unit, her expression changed subtly. She mentioned only that the young man had left, suddenly breaking his lease. Mr. Harmon had started renovations immediately after that night, unable to face another 2 a.m. visitation alone. I invited a friend to stay over. Mark arrived with beer and skepticism. In equal measure, he laughed at my detailed sound log and the dark circles under my eyes. I didn't blame him. It all sounded absurd when spoken aloud. I didn't tell him about the responsive tapping. I couldn't bring myself to voice that particular detail. We stayed up watching movies, and I watched the clock obsessively as 2 a.m. approached. Mark was half asleep on the couch. When the time came, I held my breath waiting. Nothing happened. The apartment remained silent. No gurgling, no tapping. Just the normal sounds of a building. At night, Mark left the next morning, giving me a concerned look and suggesting I might want to talk to someone about my sleep issues and anxiety. I nodded. Embarrassed and confused, had I imagined everything was this some bizarre manifestation of stress or isolation. That evening, I returned from grabbing takeout to find the hallway light on. I was certain I'd left it off. It was an old-fashioned wall switch that made a distinctive click when flipped. Not something that could be triggered accidentally. I turned it off and went about my evening trying not to assign significance to what was probably my own forgetfulness. But at 2 a.m., I woke to find every light in my apartment on, every single one, including lamps that needed to be physically switched on. The oven light behind its closed door, even the tiny LED on my electric toothbrush charging in the bathroom, all glowing all at once. And in the sudden harsh brightness, I could see something I'd missed before: a subtle discoloration on my bedroom wall, a long vertical seam where the fresh paint didn't quite match, as if a section had been patched and repainted separately from the rest of the renovation without conscious. This decision, I found myself standing before this section of wall. My hand raised, the gurgling had already begun following its usual pattern through the walls. When it reached the section before me, I placed my palm flat against the surface. It was warm, unnaturally warm, and beneath my palm I felt a distinct vibration. Not tapping this time, but a continuous tremor, as if something on the other side was pressing back. I snatched my hand away, but the sensation lingered on my skin, a phantom warmth and pressure that wouldn't fade. My heart thundered so violently I felt lightheaded. Sweat drenched my t-shirt despite the chill in the room. Every instinct screamed to run, to get out, to never return to this place. Instead, I found myself in the kitchen, returning with a hammer, standing before the discolored section of wall tool in hand. I hesitated. What was I doing? Property damage was illegal, would cost me my security deposit at minimum, but something deeper than rational thought drove me forward. Something primal that needed to know what was behind that wall. The first strike broke through the drywall easily, too easily, as if the material were softer than it should be. The second strike widened the hole enough for me to peer inside with the flashlight on my phone. What I expected, what would have been logical, was to see the ordinary innards of a wall stud's insulation, wiring, pipes, normal construction materials. What I saw instead was a narrow space, perhaps 8 inches wide, extending vertically between the studs. But instead of insulation, the space contained old copper pipes. Not the new PEX tubing Mr. Harmon had proudly shown me during the tour. These were ancient corroded tubes covered in a substance I initially took to be rust, but the color was wrong too, dark too, or organic. And wrapped around these pipes, threaded through them, woven into a complex pattern with something that resembled wiring, but moved slightly in ways electrical wiring shouldn't. I leaned closer, my phone's light revealing more detail than I wanted to see. Not wiring, something else. Something that pulsed faintly with the gurgling sound that now surrounded me. I stumbled backward, dropping my hammer with a clatter that seemed muted against the now louder liquid sounds. The gurgling had intensified, no longer confined to its usual path, but concentrated behind the wall. I just breached, and now there was a new sound underlying it, a low, wet rasp that reminded me horribly of labored breathing. The wall began to bulge outward around the hole I'd made, not cracking, not breaking, but stretching, as if the drywall had suddenly become elastic. Something was pushing through from the other side, something that made the material IAL distend in a shape that suggested fingers. I didn't wait to see more. Self-preservation finally overcame curiosity. I ran for the door, fumbling with the locks. With trembling hands behind me, I heard the distinct sound of drywall tearing, of something heavier than liquid hitting the floor. I spent that night in my car, parked several blocks away, unable to stop shaking when morning came. I called Mr. Harmon. No answer. I texted, explaining in frantic, disjointed sentences what had happened. The response, when it finally came hours later, was brief. Told you I replaced everything that needed replacing. Not my fault you disturbed what didn't. I never returned to the apartment. I sent movers for my belongings, refusing to step foot inside again. They reported nothing unusual, just a patched hole in the bedroom wall that looked like someone punched it. According to them, the apartment was silent, dry, and perfectly normal. I lost my security deposit and paid 2 additional months' rent as penalty for breaking the lease, small price for freedom. Sometimes I wonder about the building, about Mr. Harmon's renovations, about what he chose to wall. No voices, nothing to indicate human habitation. I approached 4B slowly, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. Runner standing outside Miller's door, I pressed my ear against the cool wood and listened. Nothing, no movement, no sound at all. My heart raced as I rapped lightly on the door, then more firmly when no response came. The hollow sound echoed down the empty corridor. I tried to peer through the peephole from the outside, an exercise inutility that only demonstrated my growing desperation. I returned to my apartment confused but oddly relieved. Perhaps Miller had gone on a trip. Perhaps the sounds I'd been hearing were just the building settling, and my sleep-deprived mind had been creating patterns where none existed. I fell into bed exhausted from my amateur detective work and drifted into the first deep sleep I'd experienced in months until 11:07 p.m. The sound jolted me awake, a violent scraping directly above my head, so powerful that a fine dust of plaster drifted down from a small crack in my ceiling. My body went rigid, every muscle tensing at once. My breathing became shallow and rapid as I stared upward, following the sound as it moved from above my bedroom into the living room area. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy, deliberate footsteps traversed the length of my ceiling. Whatever was up there, it wasn't Mill. It couldn't be the next morning. My hands still trembling slightly from the night before I cornered the building superintendent, Mr. Gaines, as he collected mail from the lobby. I casually mentioned the noise from apartment 4B, careful to keep my tone conversational, despite the tightness in my chest. What he told me turned my blood to ice. Miller had moved out 3 weeks ago. The apartment was empty, awaiting renovations before a new tenant could move in. I almost laughed in the superintendent's face, thinking he was confused about the apartment number. I described to Miller the hat, the briefcase, the gray coat. Mr. Gaines nodded in recognition, but confirmed that, yes, that was Miller, and yes, he had definitely moved out. Almost a month ago, he had transferred to another city for work, paid the lease termination fee, and cleared out his belongings in a single day. I stumbled back to my apartment, my mind racing through possibilities. Perhaps Miller had left some furniture behind. Perhaps the renovation crew was working late nights. Perhaps the sounds were coming from a different apartment entirely, and my spatial perception was flawed. That evening, I asked Mr. Gaines for the key to 4B, inventing a story about a package delivered to me that might belong to the former tenant. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request, but eventually relented when I suggested the alternative was disturbing the property manager over such a trivial matter. The key felt unnaturally heavy in my pocket as I rode the elevator up to the 4th floor. My stomach churned with each ascending floor, and I could feel sweat gathering at my temples. Despite the building's perpetually overactive air conditioning, the elevator doors opened with a cheerful ding that seemed obscenely out of place, given the dread coursing through me. Apartment 4B's door looked exactly like mine, down to the peeling paint around on the brass numbers. I inserted the key with a trembling hand, half expecting it not to work, but it turned smoothly. The door swung inward to reveal nothing, absolutely nothing. The apartment was completely empty, no furniture, no boxes, no renovation supplies, just bare hardwood floors covered in a thin layer of dust that clearly hadn't been disturbed in weeks. The layout mirrored my own apartment. Below, a small entryway opening to a living room with a kitchen. Alcove to the right, and a short hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the vacant space. The windows were covered with brown paper, casting the room in a dim, sepia-toned light. I moved through each room, methodically checking closets, looking behind doors, inspecting the ceiling for signs of water damage or structural issues that might explain the sounds. Nothing was out of order, no loose floorboards, no exposed pipes. Nothing that could possibly create the cacophony I'd been enduring night after night. I found myself standing in the center of what would be the bedroom directly above my own, staring at the floor as if it might reveal its secrets. The room was cold unnaturally, so, despite the warm spring day outside, my breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the stagnant air. That's when I noticed it, a perfect circle. Circle of dust-free floor, approximately 3 feet in diameter, positioned exactly where a person might stand while looking out the window. I knelt down to examine it more closely. The wood there seemed different somehow, darker, more worn, as if that specific spot had endured decades more use than the surrounding floor. My finger traced the edge of the circle, and a jolt of something static electricity, I told myself, shot up my arm. I jerked backward, losing my balance and landing hard on my tailbone. Pain radiated up my spine, but it was nothing compared to the icy terror that flooded my veins when I heard it. A soft thump from inside the empty apartment, followed by another and another footsteps. Coming from the living room, I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering so violently I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The room temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees in an instant. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stood paralyzed, listening to the slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the bedroom. Thump, thump, thump. They stopped just outside the bedroom door. The empty doorway framed nothing but the dim hallway beyond. Yet I could feel a presence there, something watching. Waiting, aware of my intrusion, I backed toward the window, my eyes never leaving the doorway. My heel hit the circle on the floor, and suddenly the temperature plummeted further. Frost began to form on the window behind me. The air felt thick, resistant, as if I were trying to move through gelatin. A whisper emerged from the empty doorway. Not words exactly, but a sound so close to human speech that my mind strained to decipher it. It grew louder, transforming from a whisper to a moan to something approaching a scream, though all without ever becoming completely audible. My paralysis broke. I lunged for the apartment door, moving faster than I had in years, driven by pure animal terror. I didn't look back, didn't stop to close the door behind me, didn't even wait for the elevator. I took the stairs 3 at a time, nearly falling twice in my desperate descent. I haven't been back to my apartment since that day. 3 weeks ago, I'm writing this from a motel room 30 miles away, paid for with nearly the last of my savings. My few valuable possessions remain in apartment 3B, but nothing could compel me to retrieve them. I've called the property management company twice the first time I asked about the history of apartment 4. B, they told me nothing unusual had ever been reported. The second time I asked about breaking my lease, they reminded me of the substantial penalty. But I don't care. I can't go back there last night. I woke at exactly 11:07 p.m. My body drenched in cold sweat for a moment in the disorientation of sleep. I thought I was back in my apartment. I could hear it clearly, the scraping sound above me followed by heavy footsteps pacing methodically back and forth. But I'm on the top floor of this motel. There is no apartment above me here. As I lay rigid in bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, a realization crept over me like a shadow. It was never about the apartment. It was never about Miller. Whatever walks those floors at night has followed me here, and I suspect it will follow me wherever I go. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of it in reflective surfaces, a tall, thin figure in a gray coat, its face obscured by the brim of an outdated hat. But when I turn to look directly, nothing is there tonight. I'll stay awake until 11:07 p.m. I'll listen for the footsteps, and I'll finally make my choice. Continue running from something that can apparently follow me anywhere, or confront whatever has decided that my ceiling is its floor. I already know which option I'll choose. Some mysteries should remain unsolved, some doors should stay closed, and some sounds like heavy footsteps in an empty apartment should be ignored, even when they shake the very foundation of your reality. Especially then, the walls of the Belmont Hotel had absorbed 70 years of whispers. I noticed it immediately, that particular silence. Old buildings have where the quiet itself feels heavy with all its holding back. My footsteps on the worn burgundy carpet echoed down the third-floor corridor, each step absorbed into the stillness. Like a stone dropped into thick mudroom, 307 waited at the end of the hallway, its brass numbers dulled with age. I had chosen this place for its location and its price, not its charm. That was my first mistake. The key was an actual metal key, not a card, another relic of the hotel's refusal to fully join the present century. It turned with resistance in the lock, as if the door itself was reluctant to allow entry. The room smelled of furniture polish and something else beneath it, a musty thickness that hung in the air like invisible smoke. Nothing remarkable at first glance. Queen bed with a faded floral comforter, heavy drapes drawn against the streetlights, a desk with a lamp casting a shallow yellow pool across its surface. Just another forgettable room in another forgettable hotel in another city I was passing through for work. I unpacked methodically as I always did, arranging my toiletries in the bathroom, hanging my suits to release their travel wrinkles, setting up my laptop on the desk. Routine calms me. I travel 40 weeks a year selling industrial equipment across 6 states. Hotel rooms are more familiar to me than my own apartment. I know their rhythms, their peculiarities. I can tell within minutes whether the shower will run hot, whether the air. Conditioning will rattle all night, whether the walls will allow me to hear every intimate detail of my neighbors' lives. But the Belmont felt different from the start. Not just old I could handle, but aware. Somehow I dismissed this thought as exhaustion from the 6-hour drive and ordered dinner from a nearby they place, ate at the desk. While reviewing tomorrow's presentation, showered, called my girlfriend back home, telling her about the eccentric old hotel with its elaborate crown molding and creaking floors. We laughed about how places like these were probably haunted. Her voice tinny through the phone speakers. I didn't mention how the silence in the room pressed against my eardrums when I wasn't speaking, or how the shadows seemed unusually deep in the corners where the ceiling light couldn't reach. Sleep came easily enough. The day's travel is sufficient sedative. I woke disoriented at 3:17 a.m. My throat parched. The digital clock's red numbers cast the only light in the absolute darkness of the room. Something had woken me, though I couldn't identify what. I reached for the water bottle on the nightstand, finding it empty. With a sigh, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the floor cold against my bare feet. That's when I heard it, a voice low and indistinct, like someone speaking just below normal conversational volume. It seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby, not my room, but close the wall shared with room 309. Perhaps I froze water forgotten, straining to make out words. The cadence was conversational, rising and falling as if in dialogue, though I could hear only one voice. I couldn't distinguish gender or age, just a continuous murmur that occasionally peaked into almost comprehensible phrases before subsiding again. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the room's warmth. Something about that voice felt wrong, the tone perhaps, or the hour, or the fact that it never paused for response. After several minutes, curiosity overcame discomfort. I pulled on sweatpants and moved to the door. Pressing my ear against it, the voice was clearer in the entryway, definitely coming from the hallway or the adjacent room. I turned the handle slowly, wincing at the slight creak as I pulled the door open an inch. Then wider, the hallway stretched empty in both directions, the dim safety lights creating pools of yellowish illumination every 15 feet. The worn carpet runner absorbed sound, creating a vacuum-like silence, but the voice continued, now seeming to emanate from directly beside my door from room 309. I stepped fully into the corridor, the door clicking shut behind me. My heart rate accelerated, each beat a distinct thump against my ribs. The voice grew neither louder nor clearer. Despite my proximity, I approached room 309, standing directly before it. The murmuring continued at exactly the same volume as if the speaker remained at a constant distance. Regardless of my movement, I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. It was nearly 3:30 a.m. What business did I have disturbing another guest? What would I even say? Yet something compelled me to knock softly, my knuckles barely making contact with the wooden door. The voice stopped immediately. Complete silence descended, broken only by my increasingly shallow breathing. I waited seconds. Stretching uncomfortably, no answer came. No sounds of movement within. Nothing to indicate anyone had heard me at all. I retreated to my room, the back of my neck tingling with the distinct sensation of being watched. Sleep eluded me for hours afterward, my body alert to every creak and settle of the old building. The voice did not resume. That night morning brought rationality with its light. I dismissed the incident as a guest with insomnia having a late-night phone conversation. The peculiar acoustics of the old hotel had simply made it difficult to pinpoint. The source at breakfast in the small hotel dining room, I casually asked the receptionist about the occupancy on the third floor. She consulted her computer, then informed me that aside from my room, the entire third floor was unoccupied. Due to ongoing renovations at the far end of the hall, a cold sensation spread across my shoulder blades. I asked specifically about room 309. She checked again, confirming it was vacant and had been for several weeks. I must have heard someone from another floor, she suggested, or perhaps sounds from the street. The building was old, and sound traveled strangely. Her explanation was practical, delivered with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to smoothing over guests' concerns. I nodded and thanked her, but a seed of unease had been planted throughout my meetings that day. My mind kept returning to that murmuring voice and the empty room it supposedly came from. I considered requesting a room change, but dismissed the thought as an overreaction. One unexplained voice in the night hardly justified disrupting my stay. Besides, I told myself it was probably just someone in another room or even outside old buildings play tricks with sound. That night, I returned late from dinner with clients. The Belmont's lobby was dimly lit, the ancient chandelier casting prismatic shadows across the worn marble floor. The night clerk nodded as I crossed to the elevator, his eyes barely lifting from his computer screen. The elevator's brass gate closed with a metallic clang that echoed up the shaft as I ascended. I felt an increasing heaviness in my chest, an inexplicable reluctance to return to the third floor. The corridor was silent when I stepped out. I walked briskly to room 307, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Inside, I prepared for bed with deliberate normality. I placed a full water bottle on the nightstand, eliminating any need to leave the room during the night before turning off the light. I checked that the door was securely locked, testing the handle twice. Sleep came fitfully, my subconscious alert for unusual sounds. I woke several times to ordinary hotel noises, the hum of the heating system, distant doors closing, water running through pipes at 24:03 a.m. I jerked fully awake. The voice had returned this time. It was louder, clearly emanating from the hallway directly outside my door. No longer a murmur, but an urgent, insistent monologue, still indistinct in its words, but unmistakable in its presence. I lay rigid in bed, cold sweat beating across my forehead. My mouth dried instantly, my tongue sticking to the roof of my mouth, every muscle tensed as I strained to understand what was being said. The voice continued unabated for several minutes, rising and falling in its intensity, but never resolving into comprehensible language. It was neither male nor female, but somehow both simultaneously, its tone shifting between what seemed like pleading and explaining. I fought the overwhelming urge to cover my ears, to block out that persistent, unintelligible speech against all better judgment. I slid from bed and approached the door. The room's chill air raised goosebumps across my arms as I pressed my eye to the peephole. The distorted, fishy view showed an empty hallway impossible. The voice was directly outside, so close it might have been speaking into the very door itself. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Logic warred with instinct. There was no explanation for a disembodied voice, yet my senses insisted on its reality. The metal knob felt impossibly cold against my palm. I turned it slowly, pulling the door open. A crack. The hallway was empty, yet the voice continued, uninterrupted now, seeming to come from the space directly before me where no one stood. My vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in as my breathing became rapid and shallow. The physical impossibility of what I was experiencing sent pulses of adrenaline surging through my body. I slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock, then backed away until my legs hit the bed. The voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost worse, expectant, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I sat motionless on the edge of the bed, ears straining for any sound. Minutes passed, nothing. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell into troubled sleep. Shortly before dawn at breakfast, I approached the front desk with as much composure as I could muster. The day clerk was an older man with weary eyes and thinning gray hair. When I mentioned hearing voices on the third floor, his expression shifted subtly from professional courtesy to guarded recognition. I pressed further, asking directly if other guests had reported similar experiences. He hesitated before admitting that yes. Over the years, there had been occasional reports of voices in the hallways, particularly on the third floor, most often in the small hours of the morning, always seemingly engaged in one-sided conversations that never resolved. He delivered this information reluctantly, watching my reaction carefully as if gauging whether he'd shared too much. I asked if he knew what the voices were saying. His response was evasive. No one had ever been able to make out specific words, only the impression of urgent communication. The phenomenon had been occurring for decades. Long before his employment, the hotel management generally attributed it to the building's acoustic peculiarities and its location near a hospital where ambulance sirens and emergency room activity continued through the night. His explanation was reasonable but delivered with the practiced ease of something repeated many times. I noticed he didn't meet my eyes as he spoke when I mentioned that the voice seemed to be directly outside my door where no one stood. He fell silent, busying himself with papers on the desk. After a moment, he asked if I would like to change rooms. I accepted immediately. My new room was on the first floor, smaller but renovated more recently. I spent the day distracted, researching the Belmont's history between meetings. The hotel had opened in 1932 and operated continuously since changing ownership several times, nothing in its public. History suggested tragedy or circumstances that might explain supernatural activity, yet online review sites contained scattered comments about strange noises and talking in the hallways that the management consistently attributed to the building's age and sound-carrying properties. That night, I slept soundly in my new room, undisturbed by voices or other phenomena. The following night passed similarly. By my final night at the Belmont, I had nearly convinced myself that my experience had been some combination of exhaustion, the building's acoustics, and my own suggestibility. As I checked out the next morning, the night clerk who was finishing his shift handed me my receipt. He commented that I seemed to have slept better after changing rooms. I agreed, adding that the third floor had been unsettling. A shadow passed across his features. He glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot before leaning slightly closer. What he told me was brief but sufficient to ensure I would never return to the Belmont. He claimed that in the 1950s, a traveling salesman like myself had stayed in room 309. For several weeks, the man had suffered from what would now be diagnosed as schizophrenia, manifesting his endless one-sided conversations with entities no one else could perceive. Hotel staff had become concerned when other guests complained, but the hotel's owner refused to evict a paying customer who wasn't violent. Eventually, the man had been found in a catatonic state, staring at the wall shared with room 307. He never spoke again and spent his remaining years in a psychiatric institution before being taken away. He had managed to write a single sentence on a piece of hotel stationery. There, still waiting for an answer, I left the Belmont that morning with my bags in a persistent chill that no amount of sunlight seemed to dispel in the weeks since I've changed hotel chains entirely. Avoiding historic properties, regardless of their convenient locations or competitive rates. I've convinced my employer to book only modern accommodations with concrete and steel construction rather than the wood and plaster of older buildings. Sometimes at night, just as I'm drifting off to sleep, I imagine I hear that voice again, urgent, insistent. Just beyond comprehension, I tell myself it's memory playing tricks, nothing more, but I always sleep with music playing now, filling the silence with something known and human, and I never ever answer if I think I hear someone speaking outside my door after midnight, because whatever was in that hallway, whatever has been trying to communicate through the thin barrier between its reality and ours, is still waiting for someone to answer, and I fear what might happen when someone finally does. Scratching started on the third night, a faint, persistent sound. Fingernails against wood, or perhaps something sharper. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each scrape, wondering if lack of sleep was amplifying ordinary house noises into something sinister. The Victorian-era house had creaked and settled from the moment I moved in, but this was different, more deliberate, more alive. I should have listened to that quiet voice of intuition that first day when Mr. Hargrove handed me the keys. With trembling hands, his eyes never quite met mine as he muttered something about the attic being off limits, storage issues, structural concerns, the usual landlord excuses, but the rent was almost criminally low for a three-bedroom house with original hardwood floors and stained glass windows. Especially in this gentrifying neighborhood, I was 34, divorced, and starting over. I couldn't afford to be picky. Remember, he'd said the only time his gaze locked with mine, the attic stays sealed. It's in the lease his pupils had constricted to pinpoints. Despite the dim afternoon light, I'd nodded and signed, barely registering the clause on page 4 prohibiting access to the third-floor space. The heavy wooden door at the end of the upstairs hallway, the one leading to the attic staircase, had been sealed with industrial-grade padlocks and what appeared to be a fresh coat of paint around the edges, as if someone had tried to permanently seal the gap between door and frame. I dismissed it as excessive caution from an elderly landlord worried about liability for the first 2 nights the house had been quiet, save for the expected settling sounds of an old structure. I unpacked my meager possessions, arranged furniture, and tried to feel at home in the cavernous rooms with their high ceilings and ornate moldings. The divorce had left me with little. Karen took most of our shared belongings along with the dog. But in those empty spaces I found a strange comfort, a blank canvas, a new beginning. But on that 3rd night, the scratching began. I told myself it was mice, maybe squirrels, that had found their way into the walls. I made a mental note to call an exterminator in the morning and pulled my pillow over my head. Sleep eventually came, but it was shallow and troubled, filled with dreams of something pacing above me waiting. Morning light dispelled my unease, as sunlight often does with night fears. I called an exterminator who promised to come the following week in the rational clarity of day. I convinced myself the noises were nothing more than wildlife, a common issue in century-old houses. I went to work, taught my high school English classes with my usual enthusiasm, and returned home feeling foolish about my midnight anxieties. That night, the scratching returned louder and more insistent. I stood on my bed and pressed my ear against the ceiling, tracking the sound as it moved from one end of my bedroom to the other. Too methodical for rodents too heavy. The movement suggested something much larger, something that dragged itself across the floor above with laborious determination. My throat tightened as I realized the implications. If something that size was in the attic, it couldn't be an animal that had accidentally found its way inside. It would have to be something that had been deliberately placed there, or something that had chosen to make its home there. Long before I arrived, sleep eluded me completely that night. I sat in the hallway beneath the sealed door, listening around 3 in the morning. I heard what sounded like a muffled exhalation, a long rattling breath from something with compromised lungs. My skin prickled with goosebumps and sweat beaded on my forehead. Despite the cool air, when dawn broke, I called Mr. Hargrove. His voice hardened when I mentioned the attic, and he dismissed my concerns with rehearsed efficiency. Probably the wind through the eaves, he suggested. Old houses make noise. Nothing to worry about when I pressed him. Mentioning the distinct sound of movement, he abruptly informed me he was late for an appointment and hung up. The following day at school, I found myself distracted, jumping at the slam of lockers and struggling to maintain my train of thought during lectures. My department head noticed my behavior and inquired if everything was all right. I deflected with a story about insomnia and promised to get more rest. How could I explain that something unseen was stalking the floor above my bedroom that my landlord seemed terrified of? Whatever lurked behind that padlocked door that evening, I invited Mark, my only friend in town, over for dinner. I needed another person to witness what I was experiencing. We sat in the kitchen eating takeout when the ceiling above us creaked a long, deliberate stride from one end to the other. Mark froze mid-bite. What the hell was that? The validation I felt was almost worth the terror. I wasn't imagining things I explained about the sealed attic, the landlord's warnings, the nightly disturbances. Mark suggested we investigate his presence emboldened me, and we ascended to the 2nd floor. Stopping before the padlocked door up close, I noticed details I'd overlooked before: deep gouges in the wood around the frame, as if something had clawed repeatedly at the edges. The paint ceiling. The door wasn't just around the edges, it formed strange symbols. At intervals halfway between hieroglyphics and mathematical notations, Mark ran his fingers over the marks. These looked like he trailed off his expression, troubled like what I pressed. He shook his head. Nothing, probably just damage from previous tenants trying to get in. But I could tell he was holding something back. Mark worked as a research librarian specializing in historical documents. If anyone would recognize obscure symbols, it would be him. We examined the hinges next. They were reinforced with multiple screws and metal plates far beyond what would be necessary for a normal door. The padlocks, 3 of them, were heavy-duty and relatively new. These weren't installed to keep people out. Mark muttered they were installed to keep something in a crash from above made us both jump. It sounded like something heavy had been thrown against the floor, or like something had thrown itself against the floor. In rage, Mark stayed only another hour before making an excuse to leave. I didn't blame him. The atmosphere in the house had become suffocating, charged with a malevolent awareness that seemed to intensify with his presence. As he left, he suggested I find somewhere else to stay for a few days. I promised to consider it, but we both knew I wouldn't. Something in me needed to understand what was happening. Even as another part screamed to run alone again, I tried to distract myself with television, but the volume couldn't mask the sounds that had begun again, an earnest, dragging scratching, and now a new noise, a rhythmic thumping like a fist pounding in frustration or a head banging repeatedly against the floor. My mouth went dry. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The logical part of my brain offered rational explanations, an animal a structural issue. Even squatters who had somehow accessed the attic from outside, but none could account for Mr. Hargrove's fear. The sealed door, or the feeling of intelligent malice that now permeated the house. I retreated to my bedroom and locked the door, though I knew it would provide little protection if whatever was above somehow broke through sleep was impossible. I lay rigid beneath my covers, tracking the movements overhead, trying to discern patterns or purpose. In the pacing around midnight, the noises abruptly stopped. The silence was somehow worse pregnant with anticipation. I strained to hear even the faintest sound, but there was nothing. Minute stretched into an hour of perfect stillness. Then I heard a new sound coming. Not from above, but from the hallway outside my bedroom. A slow dragging step followed by another. The distinct sound of labored breathing. A soft thud against my door as if something had pressed itself against the wood. The door handle turned, slowly testing the lock. I bit down on my fist to keep from screaming. My legs trembled so violently the bed frame shook. Cold sweat drenched my clothes as I stared at the handle, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. It continued to turn, applying pressure against the lock mechanism. I could hear a soft scratching at the keyhole as if something was trying to manipulate the tumblers with a claw or talon. Suddenly, my phone rang from the nightstand. The shrill tone shattered the silence, and I nearly leapt out of my skin. The door handle stopped turning. I grabbed the phone. Mark with shaking fingers. I answered. He didn't wait for my greeting. "Get out of there." "Now," he urged, his voice tight with fear. "I've been researching your house in 1897. The original owner, Theodore Blackwood, was committed to an asylum after claiming something had taken residence in his attic. Something he accidentally summoned through occult experiments. He sealed it in with binding symbols and warned it should never be released." As Mark spoke, I heard the dragging footsteps, retreat from my door, and move back toward the hallway that led to the attic. "The story gets worse," Mark continued. "Every owner or tenant since has reported similar disturbances. 3 have committed suicide. 2 disappeared without a trace. The house has been vacant for most of the last 20 years until Hargrove inherited it from his uncle. 6 months ago, my throat constricted. Why wouldn't he warned me? He probably thought it was just superstition, or maybe he was desperate to offload some of the financial burden of the property. Either way, you need to leave tonight. You can stay at my place." I agreed, promising to pack a bag and drive straight to his apartment. As I hung up, I realized the house had gone completely silent. Once more, not even the usual creaks of settling wood disturbed the stillness, moving with deliberate quiet. I grabbed a duffel bag and stuffed it with clothes and essentials. I didn't bother with most of my possessions. They could be replaced. I just needed to get out. I unlocked my bedroom door and peered into the darkened hallway. Empty, the path to the stairs was clear. I took a deep breath and stepped out. Moving quickly toward the staircase as I passed the attic door, I froze the padlocks. All three of them lay open on the floor. The door stood ajar just a few inches, but enough to reveal absolute darkness. Beyond, dark matter seemed to seep from the opening like black smoke. Though I knew that had to be my imagination, I should have run then. Every instinct urged me to flee down the stairs and out of the house, but a terrible curiosity rooted me to the spot, and after all the fear, all the sleepless nights, I needed to know what lurked in that forbidden space. I inched closer, holding my phone with its flashlight activated before me like a talisman. The thin beam did little to penetrate the unnatural darkness beyond the door. With trembling fingers, I pushed the door wider. The hinges screamed in protest. Not from disuse, but because they were bending outward. The metal warped as if by tremendous force, applied from within the heavy door, had been systematically compromised. The frame splintered where the locks had been attached. It hadn't been opened from the outside, it had been broken open from within. My flashlight beam caught movement at the top of the attic stairs, a swift withdrawal of something pale and emaciated. I heard a sound like wet meat slapping against wood as it retreated into the darkness. The smell hit me then, a putrid combination of rot ammonia and something metallic like blood. But underneath was a more disturbing scent, old paper ink and candle wax. The remnants of Blackwood's occult workings preserved for over a century in the sealed space. A low, guttural sound emerged from the darkness, halfway between a growl and speech syllables that hurt my ears and made my vision blur. The temperature in the hallway plummeted, my breath fogging before me. Self-preservation finally overcame curiosity. I staggered backward, nearly falling in my haste to put distance between myself and the open door as I turned to run. I caught a glimpse of something emerging from the darkness, a pale, elongated limb reaching around the doorframe, fingers too numerous and joints too flexible to be human. I didn't look back again. I flew down the stairs and out the front door, leaving it open behind me. I drove straight to Mark's apartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I never returned to the house, not even for my remaining possessions. Mark helped me file a police report the next day, but when officers visited the property, they found nothing. Amiss, the attic door was securely locked. They reported with no signs of damage. Mr. Hargrove expressed surprise at my paranoid delusions and offered to release me from the lease without penalty, an offer I gratefully accepted 2 weeks later while staying at a budget motel and searching for a new apartment. I received a small package in the mail. No return address, but the shaky handwriting on the label was unmistakably Mr. Hargrove's. Inside was a single key and a handwritten note. It knows you're sent now. It may follow if it does use this on any door in your home and keep that door sealed. May God forgive me, I threw the key away and moved to another state. The following week, sometimes at night, I still wake to the sound of scratching, faint but persistent, coming from the ceiling above my bed, and sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, I hear something dragging itself slowly across the floor of the vacant apartment above mine. The chlorine smell hits differently at night during the day. It's normal, expected, even mingling with the sounds of splashing and laughter. But at 2 a.m., when the building should be empty, that chemical scent hanging in the still air becomes something else. Entirely something invasive, something wrong. And when I hear water moving in an empty pool, the smell intensifies as if responding to my fear. I've been the night custodian at Westfield Community Sports Center for nearly 7 years now. It's not a glamorous J job, but it pays the bills and suits my preference for solitude. The center itself is a relic from the 1970s, a sprawling concrete structure with dated wood paneling, flickering fluorescent lights, and that particular musty odor, unique to places where thousands of sweaty bodies have passed through over decades. My shift begins at 10 p.m., after the last patrons and staff have left. I clean the weight room, sweep the basketball courts, mop the locker rooms, and ensure everything is ready for the morning crowd. Most nights are uneventful, just me and my cleaning cart, moving through the empty building, my footsteps echoing against the walls. I've grown accustomed to the various sounds an old building makes at night, the settling of foundations, the hum of vending machines, the occasional rattling in the ventilation system, but the pool area has always been different. The indoor pool is housed in its own wing, a large glass roof space with poor acoustics and perpetual humidity. Even during busy hours, voices echo strangely in there. Distorted by the water and tile surfaces at night, that echo effect seems to intensify, as if the space itself is somehow larger in the darkness. The first incident happened about 3 months after I started. I was passing by the pool entrance around midnight when I heard what sounded like someone doing laps. The rhythmic splash of arms cutting through water, the distinct sound of someone coming up for air. I froze, convinced we had an after-hours trespasser. It wouldn't be the first time some teenagers had found a way to sneak in for a midnight swim. When I pushed open the heavy double doors, the splashing immediately stopped. I hit the light switch, illuminating the vast space in harsh fluorescent light. The water surface was completely still, a perfect blue mirror reflecting the ceiling. No ripples, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I searched the entire area, checking bathroom stalls, looking behind equipment, even examining the emergency exits for signs of forced entry. Nothing. Security hadn't reported any breaches, and the building's old but functional alarm system hadn't been triggered. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, or perhaps heard water moving through the pipes. Old buildings make strange sounds after all, but it happened again 2 weeks later. This time the splashing was more frantic, like someone thrashing in the water. I rushed in, faster heart, hammering against my ribs, certain I'd find someone in trouble again. Nothing, just that impossibly still water and the overpowering smell of chlorine that seemed to cling to my clothes for hours afterward. Management brushed off my concerns when I mentioned it. The building manager, a perpetually exhausted man named Taylor, suggested it was probably just the filtration system. Cycling on the maintenance supervisor theorized that temperature changes at night cause the water to expand and contract, creating sounds. Both explanations seemed reasonable, and I wanted to believe them. For a while, I avoided the pool area. During my shifts, I'd speed through my cleaning duties there early in the evening and find reasons to stay in other parts of the building during the later hours. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I began lingering near the entrance, listening for those sounds, almost hoping to hear them again so I could prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind on a particularly cold Tuesday in November. I got my wish. The splashing was unmistakable, loud enough that it sounded like an entire swim team practicing relays. I didn't immediately rush in this time. Instead, I pressed my ear against the door, listening to the rhythmic sounds, trying to detect any pattern or explanation. Then came a new sound, a low gurgling moan that raised the hair on my arms and sent ice through my veins. I backed away from the door, my heart thundering in my chest. My first instinct was to leave to call security or even the police, but I knew what they would find. Nothing, just like every other time. Whatever was happening in there, it seemed visible or audible only to me. That night, I went home and researched the history of the sports center. The building had been constructed in 1974, renovated twice since then, but the pool area remained largely unchanged. There were no newspaper reports of drownings or accidents, no tragic stories that might explain what I was experiencing. The place had an unremarkable history, just decades of swim lessons, water aerobics classes, and community events. The following week, I brought a digital recorder with me. If I couldn't see anything unusual, perhaps I could at least capture the sounds. I set it up near the pool entrance around 11:30 p.m. and continued with my cleaning duties elsewhere. When I retrieved it an hour later, my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly press the playback button. The recording contained nothing but static and the occasional sound of the building's heating system cycling on. No splashing, no moaning, nothing. To validate what I'd been hearing, I began to seriously question my sanity. Was I experiencing auditory hallucinations? Was the isolation of night shifts finally getting to me after years? I even scheduled an appointment with my doctor, who found nothing physically wrong, but suggested I might be experiencing stress-induced sensory anomalies. He recommended a psychiatrist, but I never followed through with the referral. Instead, I became obsessed with proving what I heard was real. I installed a small personal security camera aimed at the pool, camouflaged among the safety equipment on the wall. It was technically against company policy, But my need for answers outweighed potential consequences for 3 nights. The camera recorded nothing unusual, just an empty pool area with occasional shadows cast by passing clouds over the glass ceiling. On the 4th night, everything changed. The footage began normally, the still pool illuminated by the dim emergency lighting at 1:17 a.m. The surface of the water began to ripple slightly from the center outward. As if disturbed by a gentle touch, the ripples increased in intensity until the entire pool appeared to be churning water, sloshing against the edges, and yet there was no visible cause. No object, no person. Nothing falling from above, just the water itself, moving as if alive at 1:22 a.m. The camera's image became distorted, the screen filling with static when the picture cleared. 10 seconds later, the pool was completely still again. The timestamp showed no skip in recording whatever had happened. The camera had captured it or tried to. I watched the footage over and over, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. This was proof evidence that something was happening in that pool, something that defied logical explanation. That same night, I made the decision to confront whatever was in there. I waited until 1 a.m. when the building was at its quietest. I entered the pool area, leaving the lights off, except for my flashlight. The chlorine smell hit me immediately, stronger than usual. Almost eye-watering in its intensity, I called out, my voice echoing against the tile walls. I asked if anyone was there, feeling immediately foolish for speaking to an empty room. The water remained still, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like black glass. For nearly 20 minutes I stood there waiting, listening. Nothing happened. No movement, no sound. I began to wonder if the phenomenon was somehow aware of my intentions, if it was hiding from my scrutiny as I turned to leave. Defeated in questioning my investigation, the sound began, not splashing this time, but a slow rhythmic dripping like water falling from a great height into the pool. Drop by drop, I swung my flashlight toward the sound but saw nothing. The dripping continued, growing faster, more insistent, until it became a steady stream. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The smell of chlorine became overwhelming, filling my lungs, making it difficult to breathe. The beam of my flashlight dimmed the batteries, seemingly draining. In real time, in the fading light, I saw the water begin to move, not in ripples or waves, but rising upward in a column from the center of the pool. I backed away, unable to process what I was seeing. The column grew taller, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, a head, shoulders, arms forming from liquid that somehow maintained its form outside the confines of the pool. My back hit the wall and I realized I had nowhere to run. My legs refused to move. Frozen in primal terror as the water figure drifted toward the edge of the pool. Nearest to me, it had no face, no features, just a suggestion of human form composed entirely of pool water. Yet somehow I felt it watching me, studying me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. The chlorine smell became mixed with something else, something older and more organic, like algae or river mud. My chest constricted as I struggled to breathe. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I was certain I was about to lose consciousness when the overhead light suddenly blazed to life. The water figure collapsed instantly, splashing back into the pool with a sound like a body falling from height. I looked toward the door and saw Taylor, the building manager, his hand still on the light switch, staring at me with concern and confusion. He wanted to know what I was doing in the dark, why I looked so terrified I couldn't form coherent words, could only point toward the pool that was now perfectly still under the harsh fluorescent lights. Taylor checked the time, nearly 3 a.m., and suggested I'd fallen asleep on the job, perhaps had a nightmare. The explanation was almost appealing in its normalcy, and I nearly accepted it, but then I noticed the puddle of water at my feet several yards away from the pool's edge. Water that couldn't have splashed this far. Water that smelled not of chlorine, but of river mud. Taylor saw it too. He frowned, asking if I'd spilled something when he knelt to touch it. I wanted to stop him, wanted to scream at him, not to make contact with it. The liquid seemed to recoil from his fingers, sliding away across the tile in defiance of gravity before disappearing into a nearby drain. I quit that night. Handed Taylor my keys, mumbled something about health issues, and never returned to collect my final paycheck. He didn't try to convince me to stay, just gave me an odd evaluating look before nodding slowly as if confirming something to himself. It's been 6 months since I left the Westfield Community Sports Center. I found other workday shifts only and mostly convinced myself that stress and isolation were responsible for my experiences. Almost 2 weeks ago, I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Just my name and apartment number. Inside was a USB drive containing a single video file security footage from the pool area, dated 3 days after my departure. The familiar scene of the empty pool at night, the water beginning to move with no apparent cause, but this footage continued longer than mine had the water. Rose formed its humanoid shape and then changed features appeared in the watery form, a face-taking shape, eyes, opening mouth, moving as if speaking words. The camera couldn't capture. It was my face looking back from that watery body. The video ended there, replaced by a text document containing just 3 sentences. The pool has always remembered those who fear it. It collects their reflections, their impressions left on the water. Sometimes it gives them back. I've moved twice. Since receiving that package, I avoid all bodies of water larger than a bathtub. I don't swim, don't visit beaches, don't walk near lakes or rivers. I've installed waterproof cameras throughout my apartment, focused especially on bathroom drains and faucets at night. I often wake to the sound of distant splashing, though there's no water source nearby that could EXP explain it. Sometimes the air in my bedroom smells faintly of chlorine, a scent that now sends me into immediate panic. The worst part isn't the fear of what might be following me, it's the growing sense that whatever is haunting me isn't some external entity from that pool. The real horror is the possibility that part of me never left that building, that some essential piece of my consciousness was somehow extracted and now exists separately trapped in water, trying to find its way back to me, or perhaps trying to replace me entirely. Every mirror I pass, every reflective surface shows me myself, but sometimes just for a moment my reflection seems to move independently, its expression slightly out of sync with my own, a subtle wrongness that vanishes when I look directly at it but returns in my peripheral vision. I don't know how long I can continue living this way, jumping at the sound of running water, avoiding rain, suspecting my own reflection of malevolent intent. But I know one thing with absolute certainty: whatever began in that pool isn't finished with me, and sometimes in my darkest moments of doubt, I wonder if I'm still there, standing at the edge of that pool in the middle of the night, hallucinating this entire life as my body slowly drowns, pulled under by something that has waited decades for company. The thought almost makes me hope that the flashing sounds I hear coming closer each night will finally reach me, if only to confirm which version of reality is true. The first time I heard the footsteps, I dismissed them. The second time I questioned them. By the third time, I feared them. Now I know they're waiting for me, and the worst part is that I don't know why my name is Daniel Mercer. I've worked at Crawford & Associates Accounting for 8 years, and until 3 weeks ago, my biggest concern was meeting tax season deadlines. Funny how quickly your priorities change when you realize something impossible is happening around you, something that defies explanation, something that follows you. Our office occupies the entire 4th floor of the Grayson Building, a 1970s concrete structure that's about as charming as you'd expect from that Arch at Ural era. It's all fluorescent lighting, beige carpeting, and partitioned cubicles. The kind of place designed to blend into the background of your life during business hours. It hums with activity phones ringing, printers whirring, keyboards clacking, and the constant murmur of colleagues discussing client matters or weekend plans after hours. Though it transforms, the silence becomes a presence in itself, heavy and watchful. The overhead lights cast shadows that never appear during daylight. The building settles with creaks and groans that echo through empty hallways. This never bothered me before. I've always been the one who stays late, who catches up when everyone else has gone home. I found comfort in the solitude, the peaceful productivity of working without interruption that changed 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday night. Tax season was approaching, and I had a backlog of financial statements to review by 9:30. I was the only one left on our floor, possibly in the entire building. Except for Morris, the night security guard, who usually made his rounds every couple of hours. I was hunched over my desk, spreadsheets illuminated by my desk lamp when I first heard it. Footsteps in the main corridor. Firm measured steps moving at an unhurried pace. The sound carried clearly through the silent office heel to toe, the distinctive cadence of hard-soled shoes on carpet. I assumed it was Morris doing his rounds. "Hey, Morris," I called out, not looking up from my screen, going to be another hour or so here. No response came, just the continued sound of footsteps that suddenly stopped. I frowned, lifting my head to listen. Nothing. The corridor outside my office had fallen silent. "Morris," I called again. Pushing back from my desk, the silence stretched on, broken only by the soft hum of my computer and the distant rumble of the HVAC system. A trickle of unease raised the hair on my arms. I stood, walked to my office door, and peered out into the hallway. Empty, the long corridor stretched in both directions, dimly lit by the emergency lighting. No sign of Morris or anyone else. I stepped fully into the hallway and walked its length, checking the break room, the conference area, even the restrooms. Nothing. The entire floor was deserted back at my desk. I rubbed my eyes. Fatigue was making me imagine things. Perhaps the building's old pipes or ductwork created sounds that resembled footsteps that had to be. I returned to my spreadsheets, determined to finish before midnight. 20 minutes later, the phone rang, not my direct line, but the extension on the desk adjacent to mine. A workstation that had been vacant since Lindsay from payroll left the company 4 months ago. The sudden shrill ring in the silent office made me jolt, heart hammering against my ribs. I stared at the blinking light on the phone. Base confused, that line shouldn't be active. It had disconnected it weeks ago when they collected Lindsay's equipment. It continued ringing, the sound unnaturally loud in the empty office. After 5 rings, I reached over and picked up the receiver. "Hello, Crawford and Associates," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. No one answered. Instead, I heard what sounded like someone breathing, faint but unmistakable, along with a subtle static that ebbed and flowed like waves on a distant shore. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "Hello, who is this?" The breathing continued, neither accelerating nor stopping, as if someone had called me just to let me hear them exist. The longer I listened, the more wrong it felt. The breath seemed to come at precisely timed intervals. Too regular to be natural, my mouth went dry. Look, I don't know who this is, but the line went dead. I set the receiver back in its cradle, my hand trembling slightly. A wrong number, I told myself. Or a glitch in the phone system. The rational explanations lined up in my mind, but none of them explained why my skin felt too tight, or why I suddenly wanted to be anywhere but alone in that office. I saved my work and shut down my computer. The finance statements could wait until morning as I gathered my things. The overhead lights flickered once, twice before stabilizing, just a power surge. I reasoned even as my pulse quickened, moving quickly. Now I switched off my desk lamp and headed toward the exit. The main office lights were controlled by a panel near the elevators. As I approached it, I heard the footsteps again, this time behind me. I froze mid-stride, my breath catching in my throat. The steps were closer than before, moving at that same deliberate pace, heel to toe. I turned slowly, expecting to see Morris or perhaps the cleaning crew. I'd forgotten about the hallway stretched empty before me, silent and still. "Hello?" My voice cracked. "Is someone there?" Nothing, just the soft buzz of the emergency exit sign, sweat bead on my forehead. Despite the office's chill, I was not someone prone to imagination or nerves. I dealt in numbers and certainties. In the comforting reliability of balance sheets where everything must add up, whatever this was, didn't add up. I moved quickly to the light panel and shut everything down. The office plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the exit signs and the city lights filtering through the blinds. As I turned back toward the elevators, the footsteps resumed now. From the direction of my office, they moved steadily, purposefully, coming closer. My pulse thundered in my ears as I jabbed the elevator call button repeatedly. I could hear the elevator car whirring its way up from the lobby, too slowly. The footsteps continued their approach, and now I could feel a change in the air, a drop in temperature. a heaviness that hadn't been there before the elevator dinged its arrival. Just as the footsteps reached the corner of the hallway, I practically threw myself inside, punching the lobby button and the door. Close button simultaneously as the door slid shut, I caught a glimpse of nothing, just the empty hallway. Though the sound of footsteps had been mere seconds away from rounding the corner. That night I slept with the lights on for the first time since childhood. The next morning I convinced myself I'd experienced some combination of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. The human mind seeks patterns, creates explanations, finds faces in random shapes. I'd been working too hard. That's all. Nevertheless, I found myself leaving the office promptly at 5 that evening. Something I hadn't done in years. 2 days passed without incident. My confidence returned, and with it my usual work habits, taxis, and waits for no one. After all, by Friday, I once again found myself alone in the office after hours, though I promised myself I wouldn't stay past, At 7:30, I was deep in concentration when the temperature in my office plummeted. One moment I was comfortable, the next, I could see my breath forming small clouds with each exhalation. I looked up from my computer, rubbing my arms against the sudden chill. That's when I noticed the cursor on my screen moving. I hadn't touched the mouse. My hands were nowhere near the keyboard, yet the cursor drifted deliberately across the spreadsheet I'd been working on. Highlighting a column of numbers, I stared, unable to process what I was seeing. As the cursor clicked on the sum at the bottom of the column, 14 set out 58,643, and began typing. The digits deleted themselves one by one, replaced by new numbers, 3479. My throat constricted. Those weren't just any digits, they were the last 4 digits of my social security number. I lunged forward, yanking the computer's power cord from the wall. The screen went black instantly. My chest heaved as though I'd run a marathon, cold sweat soaking through my shirt. Despite the frigid air, this couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. A notification chimed on my phone. With shaking hands, I pulled it from my pocket and looked at the screen. One new email from an address I didn't recognize. New Grayson Building. Net. The subject line read simply 3479. I didn't open it. Instead, I grabbed my coat and briefcase, not bothering to shut down properly or organize my desk as I hurried toward the exit. I heard the footsteps again, this time from multiple directions. They converged on my position from the break room, the file storage area, and the main corridor, walking faster now. Urgent, I ran the stairwell. Seemed safer than waiting for the elevator. I took the steps 2 at a time, the sound of my own panic descent echoing in the concrete chamber behind me. Or was it above me? I heard doors opening. More footsteps joining the chase. By the time I reached the lobby, I was in a full sprint. Morris looked up from his security desk, startled by my sudden appearance. "Everything all right, Mr. Mercer?" he asked, concern etched on his weathered face. I forced myself to stop, to breathe, to appear normal. I couldn't tell him I was running from nothing, from footsteps without bodies, from a presence I couldn't see. "Fine, Morris," I managed. "Just realized I'm late for dinner plans." He nodded, though his eyes remained skeptical. "Working too hard, sir. Not good for the health." If only he knew. The weekend provided sanctuary in the comfort of my apartment, surrounded by daylight and the familiar sounds of my neighborhood. The events at the office seemed distant, almost dreamlike. I considered finding another job, but how would I explain leaving a senior position during tax season? Besides, Crawford and Associates had been good to me. The pay was excellent. My colleagues respectful. Was I really going to throw that away because of some unexplained occurrences that probably had rational explanations by Monday? I'd convinced myself to return, though I made a new rule: no staying after 6. No matter what, for a week this worked. I came in early instead of staying late, maintained a friendly but casual relationship with my colleagues, and tried to forget what had happened. The incident with my computer I attributed to some kind of malware, the cold spot to a malfunctioning vent, the footsteps to the building's peculiar acoustics. Then Lindsay from payroll called me. Not the actual Lindsay. She'd moved to Seattle months ago, but a call from her old extension. I was alone in my office at 5:45, preparing to leave, when her line rang, the same line that had been disconnected, the same line that shouldn't work. I stared at the blinking light. My hand hovering midway to the receiver, every instinct told me not to answer it, but something stronger. Curiosity, perhaps, or the need to confront what was happening made me pick up. "Hello," I said, my voice steadier than I felt this time. Instead of breathing, I heard what sounded like a recording of my own voice played back at me from some previous conversation. Going to be another hour or so. Hear my greeting to Morris from that first night. Ice flooded my veins. "Who is this?" I demanded. "What do you want?" More of my own words echoed back. "Look, I don't know who this is." But then a new voice broke through, distorted as if coming from underwater or through damaged speakers. It spoke just 3 words, each one. Distinct and deliberate, the numbers wrong. The line went dead. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me wrong. Numbers, that's what this was about. Financial statements, spreadsheets. Had I made some critical error that was now manifesting in this impossible way? I pulled up the file I'd been working on that first night, scanning the columns for discrepancies. Everything looked cool, correct. But then I noticed a footnote I hadn't seen before. A small asterisk next to one of the client claim deductions. Following the reference led me to a note that simply hadn't been there before. Check storage box 3479. The digits again, my social security number's last 4. The file room was on the opposite side of the office, a windowless space lined with metal shelves and filing cabinets. During business hours, it was frequently visited after hours. It was the most isolated part of the floor. I checked my watch 6:10 p.m. I'd already broken my rule about leaving by 600. I should go home. I told myself whatever this is, it can wait until morning when others are here. But I knew it wouldn't wait. Something was trying to communicate with me, and it was using the only language it thought I'd understand: numbers. The journey to the file room felt longer than usual. The overhead lights buzzed more intensely, casting deeper shadows. Each step I took seemed to echo oddly, as if someone just around the corner was matching my pace. When I reached the file room door, my shirt was damp with sweat. Despite the building's cooling system inside, the room was colder than the rest of the office. My breath formed visible puffs as I navigated the narrow aisles between shelving units. Box numbers were organized by client and year, but also had sequential storage numbers. I found section 3000 quickly enough, then worked my way to 3479. The box was unremarkable, a standard cardboard storage container, dusty from lack of handling the label. Indicated it contained records for a client we hadn't serviced in years, a small manufacturing company that had gone out of business in 2008. 2008. Why would this be relevant? Now I pulled the box from the shelf. It was lighter than I expected, as if it contained just a few papers, rather than the thick files it should have held. The lid came off easily, revealing a single manila folder. Inside the folder tab was labeled simply Daniel Mercer. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an employee termination form with my name on it. The termination date was listed as March 15th, 2018, 7 years ago. But that was impossible. I hadn't been terminated. I was still employed here. I had just received my annual review 2 months ago, along with a modest raise at the bottom of the form, where a reason for termination should have been listed. Someone had written in block letters, "Deceased workplace accident." The paper slipped from my numb fingers. This was a sick joke. It had to be someone playing an elaborate prank. Maybe the partners were trying to push me out, make me quit, rather than fire me properly. As I bent to retrieve the fallen paper, I noticed something else in the box. A newspaper clipping yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local accountant found dead in office building." The photo beneath the headline showed the Grayson building. Police cars parked outside their lights, casting red and blue patterns on the concrete facade. The article was dated March 16th, 2018, and began Daniel Mercer, 34, was found deceased in his office at Crawford and Associates early Thursday morning by the night security guard. My vision blurred. This couldn't be real. I was alive. I was here. I could feel the paper between my fingers. see my breath in the cold air, hear my heart pounding in my chest, and suddenly I could hear footsteps again all around me, now coming from every direction and circling the file room. Not just one set, but many a crowd of invisible presences converging on my location. With them came a chorus of ringing phones, starting distant but growing closer, louder until it seemed every extension in the office was shrilling at once. I backed against the shelving unit, the box, and its impossible contents clutched to my chest. "This isn't real," I said aloud, my voice sounding hollow in the confined space. "I'm not dead, I'm here. I exist." The footsteps stopped abruptly. The phones fell silent. In their place came a new sound. The software of the building's HVAC system powering down one by one. The overhead lights began to shut off darkness, spreading through the file room like spilled ink, until only the faint glow of the emergency exit sign remained. In that dim red light, I saw my breath slow, then stop being visible altogether. The temperature had normalized whatever presence had filled the room. Moments before seemed to have withdrawn. I stood frozen for several long minutes, waiting for something else to happen when nothing did. I carefully placed the box back on the shelf and made my way through the darkened office to the stairwell. I didn't run this time. There seemed no point. Morris looked up as I emerged into the lobby, his expression neutral. "Working late again, Mr. Mercer." I studied his face, searching for any sign that he was part of this, that he knew something. All I saw was the mild concern of an aging security guard for a workaholic tenant just finished up. I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "Have a good night, Morris." "You too, sir. See you tomorrow." Woody would anyone that was 2 weeks ago, I've continued coming to work each day, arriving precisely at 9 o'clock and leaving precisely at 5. My colleagues treat me no differently. My clients call with the same questions and concerns. The office functions as it always has. Yet something fundamental has changed. I've checked public records, news archives, even my own medical files. There's no evidence I died in 2018 or any other time. The box in the file room now contains only routine paperwork for the manufacturing client. It was supposed to house the phones. Work normally, my computer behaves as expected, but sometimes when I'm alone in my office and the building grows quiet, I catch glimpses of something in my peripheral vision, shadowy figures that vanish. When I turn to look directly at them, and each night as I prepare to leave, I hear a single set of footsteps matching mine, exactly following just behind me all the way to the elevator. I don't look back anymore. I don't need to. I know the footsteps are mine. Or rather, they belong to the Daniel Mercer who never left this building on March 15th, 2018. He's trying to tell me something. Trying to make me understand a truth I can't yet grasp. The numbers don't add up, you see? And in my profession, that's something we simply cannot ignore. So I wait, and I listen, and I prepare for whatever revelation comes next. After all, what's the worst that could happen? I'm already dead. Or perhaps I never truly lived the first time I saw it. I convinced myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the light. A shadow cast by the flickering fluorescent bulb that had been threatening to die for weeks. But deep down I knew in that decrepit basement locker room with its perpetual dampness and the subtle scent of that no amount of industrial cleaner could mask something had found me, and now it wouldn't let me go. Downtown's elite fitness center was anything but elite, housed in a pre-war building with creaking floors and walls that sweated when humidity rose. It survived on cheap membership fees and its convenient location near the financial district. The equipment was outdated, the trainers half interested, but the monthly rate was something I could afford on my editor's salary, and after my divorce I needed somewhere to channel the restless energy that kept me awake at night. I preferred working out late, arriving around 8:30 p.m. When the after-work crowd had thinned, the gym closed at 10, giving me just enough time to complete my routine before the staff began their not-so-subtle hints that they wanted to lock up the basement. Locker room became my private sanctuary. Those last 15 minutes, most members avoided showering, they're preferring to head home instead. The locker room's design was a relic from another era, a narrow corridor. LED past rows of dented metal lockers to a shower area with cracked tiles and inconsistent water pressure. Halfway down this corridor stood an enormous wall-mounted mirror, easily 7 feet tall and 5 feet wide, its ornate brass frame incongruously grand. Against the utilitarian surroundings, management had probably salvaged it from somewhere else in the building during a long-ago renovation. The mirror's surface had that wavy common to old glass, subtly distorting reflections. In a way that modern mirrors don't. It was the Tuesday after Labor Day when I first noticed something. Miss I just finished an intense session on the squat rack and was alone in the locker room toweling off sweat before heading to the shower. As I opened my locker, I caught movement in the mirror's periphery, a dark smudge passing behind my reflected self. My head snapped around hard, suddenly racing, but the corridor behind me was empty. I turned back to the mirror, scanning its surface, carefully near the right edge. A slight discoloration marred the glass, like a smear of something dark or perhaps just a shadow cast at an odd angle. I reached out, running my fingers over the spot. It felt smooth and cool. Just like the rest of the mirror, the rational explanation was dirt. A poorly cleaned mirror in a basement that hadn't seen proper maintenance in decades. I mentioned it offhandedly to Miguel, the night attendant, as I left. He nodded distractedly, promising to have someone look at it tomorrow. We both knew nobody would a week pass before I noticed anything unusual again. I was alone once more, the gym nearly empty as closing time approached. Standing before the mirror adjusting my gym bag, I felt a sudden cold spot, as if walking through a pocket of frigid air in an otherwise room temperature space. The chill raised goosebumps along my arms and the back of my neck, and then at the edge of my vision, that same dark smudge seemed to move, expanding slightly before retreating to the mirror's edge. My breath caught. I stared hard at the spot, willing it to move again to confirm what I had seen. Nothing happened, but as I leaned closer to examine the glass, my reflected face appeared somehow different. The eyes a fraction too wide, the mouth set in an expression I wasn't consciously making. For just a moment, I experienced the disorienting sensation of looking at a stranger wearing my face. I backed away, gathered my things, and left without showering. Over the next few weeks, I considered switching gyms, but financial constraints and stubbornness kept me returning. I changed my routine slightly, trying to finish earlier, but inevitably found myself alone in that basement corridor as close closing time approached. And each time the phenomena grew more pronounced, the dark smudge began appearing more frequently. No longer just at the mirror's edge, but sometimes sliding across its surface. While I changed or showered, the temperature drops became more dramatic. On one occasion, my exhaled breath actually fogged in the suddenly frigid air. Most disturbing were the subtle differences in my reflection movements that lagged by milliseconds. Expressions that didn't quite match my own, a sense that what I was seeing wasn't quite in sync with reality. When I finally mentioned these occurrences to Miguel, his reaction was predictably dismissive. He reluctantly accompanied me to the locker room, where of course nothing unusual happened. Standing beside me, he peered into the mirror and saw only what should be there. Two men in a dingy basement. He suggested with poorly concealed impatience that perhaps I was overtraining or needed more sleep. The lighting down here was bad. He reminded me always playing tricks on people, but I knew what I had seen. What I continued to see when no one else was present, I began researching the building's history. Downtown Myrtle Bank had constructed it in 1908, and it had housed various businesses over the decades before becoming a fitness center in the late 90s. The basement had served many purposes. Storage file room, even briefly as a small employee cafeteria in the 60s. Nothing in the public record suggested tragedy or death that might explain a haunting. If that's what this was. October arrived, bringing earlier sunsets and a perpetual chill to the basement locker room. My encounters with whatever lurked in the mirror grew more intense one evening while showering. I distinctly heard whispers emanating from the drain, too faint to discern words, but unmistakably human. In cadence, when I hurriedly shut off the water and grabbed my two, I found footprints on the floor leading from the mirror to the shower stall, damp. Impressions that couldn't be mine because they approached from the wrong direction. They evaporated as I watched, leaving no trace, except my accelerated heartbeat and the cold sweat that had nothing to do with my workout. That night, my sleep was plagued by dreams of the mirror in my nightmare. I approached it endlessly down a corridor that stretched longer with each step. My reflection waited patiently, growing more distinct as I struggled to reach it, but the face looking back wasn't mine, or rather it was mine, but wrong, like a photographed negative. With hollow eyes and a mouth stretched too wide in a grimace, masquerading as a smile, I woke gasping, sheets damp with sweat. The bedside clock displaying 3:33 a.m. For several minutes I sat upright, convincing myself there was no mirror in my bedroom, no watching presence in the darkened corners. When sleep finally reclaimed me, it was thin and restless. The next day I asked Diane, the morning manager who worked at the gym, since its opening, about the mirror. Her response was unexpected. She paused, keys jingling in her hand, and asked why I wanted to know. There was something guarded in her expression that hadn't been there before. I kept my explanation vague, just curious about such an ornate piece in an otherwise utilitarian space. Diane revealed that the mirror had been there when they took over the building, too heavy and cumbersome to move. She'd wanted to remove it during renovations, but the owner had insisted on leaving it something about architectural integrity or historical preservation. She hurried away after that, suddenly remembering an appointment. She was lying. I was certain of it that evening. I purposely arrived later than usual. The gym was nearly empty, just a couple of regulars finishing half-hearted sets before heading home. Miguel was nowhere to be seen. Unusual, since he was typically stationed near the entrance. At this hour, I completed an abbreviated workout, my attention focused more on the approaching solitude than on proper form or rep counts. By 9:45, I was alone. The overhead speakers announced 15 minutes until closing, the automated message echoing through empty rooms. I descended the stairs to the basement, each step heavier than the last. Some irrational part of me hoped that confronting whatever dwelt in the mirror might end this escalating situation. Another part recognized the foolishness of intentionally seeking out something I didn't understand. The locker room corridor seemed darker than usual. Two of the fluorescent tubes had failed, leaving pools of shadow between islands of harsh light. The air felt thicker, more resistant, as if the oxygen percentage had subtly decreased, and it was cold, much colder than the autumn night outside. Warranted standing before the mirror, I saw only my ordinary reflection. At first, a middle-aged man with tension evident in the set of his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes. I waited, breathing carefully, watching for any anomaly. Minutes passed. Nothing happened, just as I began to feel foolish, ready to chalk up my experiences to overwork and an active imagination. The fluorescent light directly overhead flickered and went out. The mirror's surface darkened, and in that moment of semi-darkness, my reflection changed. It was still recognizably me, but the eyes now held an emotion. I wasn't feeling a malicious amusement that sent adrenaline coursing through my system as I stared, paralyzed. My reflection's head tilted slightly, a movement I hadn't made. Its lips parted in the suggestion of a smile. The light above sputtered back to life, and the reflection normal IED. But I had seen enough. This wasn't imagination or a trick of light. Whatever looked back at me from that glass wasn't me. At least not entirely. I backed away, heart hammering against my ribs, mouth dry with fear. My reflected counterpart matched my movements perfectly now, the momentary divergence apparently over. But I knew what I had seen. The basement speakers crackled with the 10-minute warning I should leave. Every instinct screamed to run from this place and never return. Instead, I found myself stepping closer to the mirror, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. "What are you?" My voice emerged as a hoarse whisper. My reflection mowed the same words. Synchronized once more, but then as I watched, a subtle change rippled across its features. The eyes darkened, the pupils expanding until little iris remained. The head tilted again, that not quite natural angle suggesting curiosity or perhaps predatory assessment. Behind my reflection, the dark smudge I'd noticed weeks ago expanded, spreading like spilled ink across the mirror's surface. It no longer resembled a shadow or stain, but something three-dimensional that existed behind the glass. Extending outward as it grew, the temperature plummeted. My breath clouded before me in short panic bursts. The overhead lights flickered again, and in that strobing effect, I saw my reflection step backward while I remained frozen in place. The distance between us increased with each flicker, until my doppelganger stood fully 5 feet behind where it should be receding into a space that couldn't exist. It raised one hand in a gesture that might have been farewell or invitation. The darkness behind it consolidated, taking vague form a suggestion of height of mass of limbs that moved wrong. Whatever it was, it dwarfed my afflection, enveloping it. Partially in what might have been an embrace or consumption, I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the uneven floor. The fall saved me as I crashed to the ground. My gaze broke from the mirror, the spell of paralysis shattered with the eye contact. I scrambled up and ran, dignity forgotten in the flight response that overrode all other concerns behind me. The temperature normalized with each step I took away from the mirror. By the time I reached the stairs, I felt only the usual basement chill rather than the bone-deep cold of moments before Miguel stood at the front desk, eyebrows rising at my disheveled appearance and the fact that I still wore my workout clothes. Gym bag clutched in white-knuckled hands, he asked if everything was all right. I mumbled something about not feeling well and hurried past, unwilling to explain or perhaps unable to find words that wouldn't sound deranged. I didn't return to the gym for a week. During that time, I researched mirrors in folklore and urban legends, finding countless stories of mirrors as portals or traps for spirits. Most cultures had some taboo or superstition regarding mirrors and darkness. None of it helped me understand what was happening at Elite Fitness, but it confirmed I wasn't alone in fearing what might lurk behind reflective surfaces when I finally returned. It was midday, the gym crowded with lunch break warriors and retirees using their discounted daytime memberships. I avoided the basement entirely, using the small restroom near the entrance instead. But as my workout ended, I found myself drawn downstairs by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The locker room was occupied. This time, 2 men changing after their workouts, their conversation about protein supplements echoing off the tiled walls. I positioned myself to keep the mirror in view while I changed. Watching for any abnormality with others present, the glass remained just glass, my reflection behaving as it should as the men left. One of them nodded to me in passing. I nearly grabbed his arm, nearly begged him to stay instead. I watched them disappear up the stairs, leaving me alone once more. With the mirror, the familiar cold descended immediately, as if it had been waiting just beyond the threshold of perception. My reflected self looked back at me, eyes dark and knowing a slight smile playing at lips that I could feel, remained pressed in a grim line on my actual face. "What are you want?" I whispered the reflection. Smile widened behind it. The darkness gathered again, taking more substantial form than before. It suggested a human silhouette, but wrong proportions. Exaggerated limbs too numerous or too long, it loomed over my doppelganger with what I could only interpret as possessive intent. My reflection's lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow I understood wrecking company release. The overhead light flickered and my reflection retreated further into the impossible space behind the glass. One hand extended toward me, palm up in unmistakable invitation behind it. The darkness parted like a curtain, revealing glimpses of a place that wasn't a place. A void punctuated by fragments of what might have been other rooms, other mirrors, other trapped observers. I understood then the mirror wasn't haunted, it was a door, and whatever had assumed my likeness was a gatekeeper seeking to draw me through. I backed away, shaking my head. My reflection's expression hardened, the simulated humanity dropping away to reveal something ancient and patient and hungry. The darkness behind it surged forward, pressing against the glass like a membrane about to rupture. The mirror's surface rippled actual physical movement, distorting its reflective plane. A sound filled the room, not heard with ears but felt in bone and tissue, a subsonic vibration that rattled fillings and set nerve endings alight with pain. I ran up the stairs past startled staff out into the street, where I gulped fresh air in desperate lungfuls. I never returned to Elite Fitness after that day, forfeited my membership, abandoned my locker contents, ignored the automated emails asking why I'd left sometimes, passing reflective surfaces, store windows, car mirrors, even my phone's darkened screen. I catch movement at the periphery of my vision. a familiar silhouette watching, waiting for recognition or invitation. I've covered the mirrors in my apartment, learned to shave by touch rather than sight, because I know what waits on the other side of the glass, and I know that each time I meet those eyes, the barrier between us wears thinner. One day, perhaps no mirror will be needed at all. Until then, I avoid my reflection and try not to think about that other self waiting in the darkness beyond the mirror's edge. Sometimes, though, I wonder if I made the right choice, if what looked back at me from that basement mirror was truly malevolent or merely different, if the darkness had offered was oblivion or transformation, and in those moments of doubt when my guard is lowest, I feel it watching patient eternal, certain that eventually curiosity will overcome caution. After all, we're reflections of each other, and mirrors don't forget the faces they've shown. The first time I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched, was on a Tuesday. In late October, the fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered, casting elongated shadows that seemed to follow me as I walked toward the equipment storage room. I dismissed it as fatigue, a natural consequence of hosting midnight musings, 5 nights a week at our small community radio station. But even as I told myself it was nothing, the hairs on the back of my neck stood rigid and my pulse quickened with each step down that corridor. Something had changed in the building, something was different, something was there. I've been working at WKRP for almost 3 years now. It's nothing impressive, just a small radio station servicing our rural county with local news music and the occasional call-in show. The building itself is unremarkable, a converted 2-story house from the 1960s with offices upstairs and studios on the main floor during the day. It's alive with activity producers darting between rooms, guests waiting in the small reception area, phones ringing. But after 11, it transforms into something else entirely. The cheerful bustle gives way to hollow silence, interrupted only by the hum of equipment and my own voice echoing through the empty rooms. It's just me and Marco. Then he's our night technician, a man of few words who spends his shift locked away in the control room, monitoring levels and occasionally slipping me notes about time constraints or upcoming segments. We rarely speak beyond brief exchanges about the show's logistics. I never minded the solitude. In fact, I cherish those quiet hours alone with my thoughts and the microphone. Until recently, that first night, I had just finished recording a promo for an upcoming interview. The clock on the wall read 12:38 a.m. I needed to retrieve some backup equipment from storage. A microphone to replace one that had been acting up. The storage room sits at the end of a long hallway, past several darkened offices. In the break room, I'd made this walk hundreds of times before without a second thought. The moment I stepped into the hallway, my body tensed, my skin prickled with goosebumps. Despite the building's adequate heating, each step I took seemed to produce an echo that didn't quite match my movements, as if a second set of footsteps followed just microc behind mine. I stopped, the echo continued for one more step before ceasing. My mouth went dry. I called out to Marco, thinking perhaps he had emerged from his technical sanctuary for a rare bathroom break or coffee run. No response came, just the persistent buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead and the sudden deadening sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I forced myself to continue walking, my eyes scanning every shadow, every doorway. When I reached the storage room, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling slightly. I grabbed the microphone and hurried back to the studio, unable to shake the feeling of invisible eyes tracking my movements. I mentioned nothing to Marco that night. What was there to say that I thought the empty building was following me? That shadows seemed to move in my peripheral vision. He'd think I was losing my grip, too many late nights and too much coffee. The next 3 shifts passed without incident. I began to relax, dismissing that night as nothing more than exhaustion playing trick on my mind. But then came Friday. I was in the middle of a segment about local history when the temperature in the studio plummeted. My breath fogged in front of my face, and through the glass partition I could see Marco's confused expression. As he adjusted dials and checked settings, I continued speaking, professional instincts overriding my growing unease as I leaned toward the microphone. A distinct sound emerged from just behind my right shoulder, a soft, deliberate throat clearing as if someone was preparing to speak. My words died in my throat. I spun around, nearly toppling my chair. The studio was empty through the glass. I could see Marco staring at me, his eyebrows raised in question. I gestured vaguely at my throat and took a sip of water, forcing myself to continue the broadcast. After only a brief awkward pause, the remainder of the show passed in a blur, my senses hyper-alert to every creak and hum in the building. When the on-air light finally went dark, I confronted Marco. Had he heard anything unusual? Did he notice the sudden temperature drop? He shook his head, looking at me with growing concern. He suggested I was coming down with something, that perhaps I should take the weekend to rest. I nodded, agreeing without conviction yet. As I gathered my belongings, I noticed him glancing nervously at the dark hallway beyond the control room. He might not have acknowledged it, but something had unsettled him too. The weekend offered no respite. I lay awake in my apartment, replaying those moments in the studio, questioning my perceptions. By Monday, I had nearly convinced myself it was all in my head. Stress, exhaustion, perhaps even the early stages of an illness. I returned to the station with renewed determination to focus solely on my work. That resolve shattered the moment I stepped through the doors. The air inside felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The familiar surroundings seemed subtly altered, as if everything had been shifted an inch to the left. I nodded a greeting to the daytime staff, none of whom seemed to notice anything. Was I truly the only one who felt it? The day's staff filtered out as evening approached, leaving just me, Marco, and whatever else now occupied the building. I settled into the studio, reviewing my notes for the night's show while Marco ran through his pre-broadcast checks. The first 2 hours went smoothly. Music interludes, local news, a few pre-recorded interviews around 1 a.m. I announced a 15-minute break and left the studio to use the restroom. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, the end seeming much farther away than I remembered. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed and flickered, creating stroboscopic patterns on the worn carpet. I walked quickly, keeping my eyes fixed ahead, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder in the restroom. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. Dark circles had formed under my eyes. My skin appeared sour under the harsh lighting. I looked like a man hunted as I dried my hands. I heard it again, that deliberate throat clearing coming from one of the stalls behind me. My heart lurched painfully against my rib cage. I knew with absolute certainty that I had been alone when I entered. I had checked a new habit born of growing paranoia. My legs felt leaden as I turned slowly to face the row of stalls. All doors stood open, all stalls empty. A violent shiver ran down my spine as I backed toward the exit. My hand fumbled for the doorknob, refusing to turn away from those empty stalls as I pushed the door open. A whisper emerged from the last stall, so faint I almost missed it. "Stay," I ran, dignity abandoned. I sprinted down the corridor toward the studio, toward Marco, in the comforting presence of another human being. I burst into the control room, startling him so badly he knocked over his coffee. His eyes widened as he took in my appearance, face-pale breathing. Ragged before I could explain, before I could put words to the terror coursing through me. A tremendous bang echoed through the building. The door to the hallway had slammed shut with such force that the glass partition between the studio and control room vibrated. Marco jumped to his feet, asking what the hell that was. I struggled to form a coherent response, managing only to ask if anyone else was in the building. He shook his head, insisting he had been locked in the control room the entire time. We checked the security system together, reviewing the footage from the single camera mounted in the reception area. Nothing, no movement, no unexplained shadows. Nothing to account for the slamming door or the voice I was certain I had heard Marco suggested a draft. An open window somewhere in the building, I nodded, clinging to this rational explanation despite knowing all windows remained sealed against the autumn chill. Somehow I finished that night's broadcast. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Marco watched me carefully throughout the remaining hours, his concern evident in the frequent glances he cast my way. When the show finally ended, he offered to walk with me to my car. I accepted gratefully, though neither of us acknowledged the reason for this sudden courtesy. The following week brought new manifestations. Items in the studio moved when I wasn't looking. A coffee mug shifting positions, my notes rearranging themselves. A chair turned to face the door rather than the microphone. The temperature fluctuations continued isolated to whatever room I occupied, and always the feeling of being observed, of being followed. I began recording everything using my phone. I captured audio during my walks to the storage room, during breaks in the broadcast. During those tense moments after Marco had gone to the control room and I sat alone in the studio, most recordings revealed nothing beyond the building's normal sounds. The creak of settling foundations, the hum of electricity, the distant rumble of the HVAC system. Until last Tuesday, I was reviewing a recording from the previous night, earbuds in volume at maximum. I had been walking to the storage room, narrating my movements in a whisper as I went beneath my voice. Beneath the sound of my footsteps, I heard something else. A second set of footsteps perfectly synchronized with mine except for a slight delay, as if whatever followed deliberately matched my pace and then unmistakably that. Throat clearing close enough to the phone that it should have been visible in frame had I been recording video instead of audio. My finger hovered over the delete button. Part of me wanted to erase this evidence, to continue pretending this was all in my mind, but I couldn't. Instead, I transferred the file to my computer and enhanced the audio. Isolating that foreign sound, what emerged chilled me to my core. It wasn't just a throat clearing. There were words beneath that sound, barely audible, even with enhancement. "I've been waiting for you." I played the recording for Mark that night. His face drained of color as he listened for weeks. He had been humoring me, I realized, offering rational explanations, suggesting I see a doctor about stress or sleep deprivation. Now faced with irrefutable evidence, he admitted that he too had experienced things. Equipment malfunctions that technicians could never explain, strange sounds coming through his headphones when no microphones were active. The persistent feeling of being watched when he used the restroom down on the hall. We spent hours that night after the broadcast sharing our experiences, comparing timelines. The phenomena had begun approximately 6 weeks ago, shortly after the station manager had brought in some old broadcasting equipment, purchased at an estate sale, vintage. Microphones, a turntable, and several boxes of records from a station that had gone defunct in the 1970s. Marco mentioned that one of the previous owners had died in a broadcasting accident, electrocuted while trying to repair equipment during a thunderstorm. I suggested we research this further, learn more about the station's history and its former employees. Marco agreed, though neither of us acknowledged what we were really discussing. The possibility that we were being haunted by someone who had once sat where I now sat each night, someone whose connection to broadcasting transcended death itself. Last night I came prepared. I brought salt, a protective barrier according to folklore, digital recorders for each room, and a small camera to keep on my person. Marco raised his eyebrows but said nothing as I set up my makeshift ghost hunting equipment. We had moved beyond skepticism into a shared acceptance of our reality. However bizarre the broadcast began normally, I introduced the night's topics, played several songs requested by late-night listeners, and conducted a pre-recorded interview with a local author. During a music break, I left the studio to check one of my recorders in the break room. The hallway felt especially oppressive that night, the air thick and resistant, as if I were walking through water rather than empty space. The break room door stood ajar, though I distinctly remembered closing it. My recorder sat undisturbed on the table, its red light blinking steadily as I reached for it. The temperature plummeted, my breath fogged before me, and the small hair on my arm stood rigid. The feeling of being watched intensified until it was almost a physical pressure against my skin. I turned slowly, camera in hand, and for the first time I saw it not clearly. Not as a defined shape, but as a disturbance in the air. A rippling like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. It hovered in the doorway, blocking my exit. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs and sweat broke out across my forehead. Despite the rigid air, the camera slipped from my trembling fingers, clattering to the floor. That's when it spoke. Not a whisper this time, but a full voice, raspy and static-filled like someone speaking through an old radio with poor reception. "You've taken my place." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Filling the room, filling my head, I pressed back against the table, trying to put distance between myself and that shimmering disturbance. My throat constricted, making it difficult to breathe, let alone respond. The ripple moved closer, the temperature dropped further until it hurt to inhale. On the table behind me, the recorder sparked and died, its batteries draining instantly. The lights overhead flickered violently, then stabilized at half their normal brightness. I found my voice at last, though it emerged as a hoarse whisper. I asked what it wanted, why it was here, who it had been. The ripple expanded, filling my field of vision for just a moment. Within that disturbance, I glimpsed a face gaunt with hollow eyes and lips pulled back in what might have been a smile or a grimace. Then it was gone, the ripple, contracting to a small point before vanishing entirely. The temperature began to rise immediately, the oppressive feeling lifting like a weight removed from my chest. I remained frozen for several minutes, unable to move, unable to process what had just occurred. The sound of Marco's voice over the intercom finally broke my paralysis. The music had ended and I was due back in the studio on unsteady legs. I retrieved my camera and the now dead recorder and made my way back. Marco took one look at my face and knew something had happened. He mouthed, "What, through the glass?" But I could only shake my head and prepare to continue the broadcast. My voice shook, noticing L for the first few minutes until I managed to regain some semblance of professional composure. After the show, I showed Marco the camera footage, a blurry, shaking view of the break room, then the ripple in the air, indistinct but undeniably there. The audio captured the voice clearly, those 4 words hanging between us as we listened. "You've taken my place." We stayed until dawn, scouring the internet for information about the station's history, about the man who had died here decades ago. We found little beyond what we already knew his name. Richard Carlson, his position night host like me. The circumstances of his death, electrical accident during a storm. No photos, no detailed employment history. Nothing to explain his apparent attachment to the station or his apparent resentment toward me. I called in sick tonight. I couldn't bear the thought of returning to that building, of walking those halls, knowing what waited for me there. Marco reported that everything seemed normal in my absence. No temperature fluctuations, no equipment malfunctions, no disembodied voices. It only happens when I'm there, only me tomorrow. I need to make a decision. Do I return to the station, confront whatever Richard was in life and remains in death? Do I resign, walking away from a job I once loved, or is there some middle ground? A way to acknowledge his presence, perhaps even share the space he clearly still considers his own for now? I sit in my apartment, lights blazing against the darkness, jumping at every creak and groan of the building settling around me. Sleep feels like a distant memory. Each time I close my eyes, I see that ripple in the air, that almost face within it. And I wonder if I turn on the radio right now and tune to our station's frequency, whose voice would I hear in the dead of night? Marco's pre-recorded announcements filling in for my absence, or something else entirely. Something that's been waiting for decades for its chance to return to the airwaves. I don't dare find out not tonight. Instead, I write this account as a record, as a warning to who I'm not sure, perhaps to myself. Should I forget the reality of what I've experienced, perhaps, to whoever takes my place? Should I choose not to return? Because one thing is certain, that voice, that presence, that former host isn't going anywhere. The station belongs to him in ways I'm only beginning to understand, and the most terrifying realization is that I'm not sure he's content merely to observe anymore. That ripple moved with purpose last night. Those words carried intention. "You've taken my place," not a statement of fact, but an accusation, a prelude to something else, something worse. And if I return tomorrow night, I fear I'll discover exactly what that something is. Tire and the shadows have a weight to them in this part of town. I noticed it the first time I ran past the old Westbrook textile mill. How darkness doesn't just fall here, it seeps from the brick walls like black ink pooling in corners where streetlights refuse to reach. Even in the fading twilight, there's something wrong about how the building looms against the sky, its broken windows like sightless eyes. Watching traffic thin as the workday ends, I should have paid more attention to that first instinct, that initial tightening in my chest. Our bodies know things long before our minds catch up. I've been running this route for 8 months now. 5 nights a week, rain or shine, the steady rhythm of my footfalls on asphalt has become my meditation. After 12 hours hunched over architectural plans at Denholm & Sons, the path cuts through the industrial district, winds past the abandoned mill and loops back toward my apartment complex, a perfect 5M circuit that clears my head better than any therapist or whiskey ever could. The old Westbrook Mill dominates a full city block, a relic from the 1920s when this town was known for its textiles rather than its decay. The main building stretches 4 stories high, flanked by a smaller storage facility, and what was once an administrative office. A rusted chain-link fence surrounds the property. Those sections have collapsed, offering easy access to urban explorers and homeless seeking shelter signs. Warning of trespassing and structural hazards hang at irregular intervals. Their red lettering faded to the color of dried blood. 3 weeks ago, something changed. I had just rounded the corner onto Mulberry Street when a peculiar chill traveled up my spine, that ancient animal sense of being watched. My pace faltered as sweat turned cold against my skin. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see another runner, or perhaps someone walking their dog in the gloaming. The street stretched empty behind me, with shuttered storefronts and parallel parked cars. I shook it off and continued, but my rhythm never quite recovered. My breaths came shorter, a faint ringing in my ears, drowning out my music as I passed the main gate of the mill. The sensation intensified, a pressure against the back of my skull like invisible fingers probing for weakness. I ran faster, muscles burning, until I was well clear of the property. The feeling vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me doubled over with hands on knees, gulping down air. Half a mile from the mill, I told myself it was nothing, just the natural weariness that comes from running alone at dusk through a semi-deserted area. Still, I slept poorly that night. Dreams filled with the sound of machinery I couldn't see, and the sensation of fabric brushing against my face the following evening. I almost changed my route, but routine is a powerful force, and I reasoned that breaking it would only validate an irrational fear, so I laced up my running shoes and headed out. Deliberately pushing thoughts of the mill from my mind, the sensation returned the moment I turned onto Mulberry. This time it wasn't just a feeling of being watched, it was the certainty of it. My skin prickled with gooseflesh. Despite the warm September air, I found myself glancing frequently over my shoulder, each time expecting to catch someone ducking into an alleyway or behind a car, but the street remained deserted, save for myself and the lengthening shadows as I approached the mill. My pace unconsciously slowed. The building seemed different, somehow more defined against the darkening sky, its contours sharper as though it had shifted slightly toward the street. My heart hammered against my ribs, no longer from exertion but from a mounting dread. I couldn't rationalize, that's when I saw it. A flicker of light from a third-floor window, just a brief illumination, like someone passing in front of a lantern. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring up at the now dark window. Logic asserted itself. Probably kids with flashlights, urban explorers documenting the decay, or homeless people seeking shelter. Yet something about the quality of that light seemed wrong. Not the harsh white of LED flashlights or the yellow of flame, but a pale blue-green glow like phosphorescence. I continued my run, pushing myself harder than usual, eager to put distance between myself and Westbrook Mill behind me. I could have sworn I heard the faint clacking of machinery, a rhythmic thumping that matched neither my footfalls nor my heartbeat. When I glanced back one final time before turning the corner, I thought I saw that same phosphorescent light moving from window to window on the top floor, as though someone were pacing for 5 nights straight. I avoided that route entirely, opting instead for the well-lit paths of Riverview Park, but the park closed earlier now that autumn was setting in, and the alternative routes added nearly 2 miles to my run after a particularly stressful day at work, a major project falling through after months of planning. I found myself craving the familiar femme loop. I told myself I'd been letting my imagination run wild. The mill was just a building, nothing more. I set out earlier than usual, hoping to pass the mill while some daylight still remained. The air hung heavy with the threat of rain clouds building in the west. I felt fine for the first 2 miles, even optimistic. Then I turned onto Embury. The street was different in the fading daylight, less menacing, more decrepit. The mill stood as it always had, windows, blank brick facade stained with decades of pollution and neglect. I maintained my pace, deliberately keeping my eyes forward. Just another quarter mile and I'd be past it. The sensation built more gradually this time, a subtle awareness blooming into discomfort, discomfort into dread. The invisible pressure returned to the base of my skull, joined now by a low, barely perceptible hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. My pace quickened involuntarily as I drew level with the main gate. Movement caught my eye. Something shifting behind a ground floor window. I slowed despite myself peering through the chain-link fence. The broken window in question gaped black against the brick, showing nothing but the darkness. Beyond, I was about to continue when a pale shape moved within that darkness, just a flash of something lighter than the surrounding shadows there, and gone too quickly to identify. I stopped completely. The humming grew louder, resolving into a sound I recognized with sudden, inexplicable certainty, the sound of loons, dozens of them. Shuttles flying back and forth, creating fabric from thread with mechanical precision. But the mill had been closed for over 30 years. A rational voice in my head urged me to leave to complete my run and forget this place. Instead, I found myself approaching the fence, fingers curling around the rusted metal links up close. The mill seemed to pulse with suppressed energy, as though holding its breath. The light was nearly gone now. The first fat droplets of rain speckling the dusty ground at my feet. I found a tear in the fence, and against every instinct of self-preservation slipped through. The mill's courtyard was littered with debris, broken pallets, rusted machinery parts, shattered glass. The main entrance stood 20 yards away, its heavy doors chained shut. But to the left, a smaller door hung partially open. Its lock long since pried away. The sound of the looms grew louder as I approached, though still muffled, as if coming from deep within the building beneath it. I could now discern other sounds, the creaking of floorboards, the soft whir of spinning wheels, and something else. Something like breathing, but too regular, too mechanical. I paused at the doorway. Rain now falling steadily, plastering my shirt to my back, the darkness. Beyond seemed absolute, a physical presence waiting to envelop me. I fumbled for my phone. Switching on its flashlight, the beam cut through the gloom, revealing a narrow hallway strewn with debris. Graffiti covered the walls. Crude tags, mostly, but here and there more elaborate designs. A skeletal loom operator, hands bound to his machine with thread. A faceless figure standing among empty spindles. A single eye woke into fabric. The beam of light shook with my trembling hand as I stepped inside. The air changed immediately colder, denser, carrying the sense of mildew, rust, and something else, something like scorched hair or burning oil. The sounds were clearer now, the phantom looms working at a feverish pace somewhere above me. I made my way cautiously down the corridor, stepping over fallen ceiling tiles and navigating around toppled filing cabinets. My breathing seemed unnaturally loud, echoing back at me from unseen walls. Water dripped somewhere ahead, a steady plink. Plink, plink. Counting seconds. I shouldn't be spending here at the corridor's end. A stairwell LED upward, its metal steps groaning under my weight. The second floor was a vast open space, support columns rising at regular intervals like ancient trees in a petrified forest. My flashlight beam seemed weaker here, penetrating only a few feet before being swallowed by shadow. The floor was littered with broken machinery parts, gears, spindles, shuttles, arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The sounds of the phantom looms had faded, replaced by a heavy silence. I swept my light around slowly, heart hammering so violently I felt lightheaded. Nothing moved in the darkness, yet the sense of presence was overwhelming. I was not alone. Hello, the word escaped before I could stop it. Hanging in the stale air, no response came, but the quality of the silence changed. It was now attentive, focused as I turned to leave. My light caught something on the far wall, a shape darker than the surrounding darkness. I stepped closer, compelled by a curiosity stronger than fear. It was a tapestry, enormous and ancient, hanging from ceiling to floor. The fabric was discolored with age, its pattern difficult to discern in the poor light. I moved closer, still raising my phone higher. The tapestry depicted the mill itself, rendered in exquisite detail down to the very window I'd seen the light in days before. Around the building, barely visible figures stood in a circle, heads tilted upward, faceless yet somehow expectant, and at the very top, barely caught in my failing light. A single figure stood at a window watching a floorboard creak behind me. I whirled around, light slashing wildly through darkness. Nothing, but as I turned back to the tapestry, my blood froze in my veins. The figure in the window had moved. It was no longer watching the street, but looking directly outward toward the viewer. Toward me, my phone's light flickered once, twice, then died in the sudden darkness. I heard the loom start up again, louder than before, the shuttles flying back and forth with impossible speed, and beneath that mechanical rhythm, footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the floor toward me. I ran blind in the darkness. I collided with columns and tripped over debris, guided only by my desperate memory of the stairwell's location. The footsteps followed, unhurried, yet somehow keeping pace. I found the stairs more by luck than design, half falling down than in my haste. My knee struck metal with a pain that shot up my leg, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Back in the corridor, faint light from the open door provided just enough illumination to navigate. I sprinted toward it, lungs burning, the sound of pursuit growing ever closer as I burst outside into the rain. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the courtyard in stark white light for an instant. Just an instant, I saw my pursuer framed in the doorway behind me. Me, a figure formed not of flesh, but of tightly woven threads, its body rippling as though moved by an unfelt breeze where its face should have been. There was only a complex knot of fibers, constantly unraveling and reforming. Lightning faded, plunging the scene back into darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, soaked through and gasping for breath. I spent that night with every light burning, jumping at shadow in the normal settling sounds of the building sleep. When it finally came, brought dreams of being wrapped in threads that tightened with each breath. The next day, I called in sick to work and spent hours researching the history of Westbrook Mill. Most sources mentioned only its closure in the late 1980s due to overseas competition, but in the archives of the local newspaper, I found darker stories. A fire in 1938 that claimed 12 lives, accusations of unsafe working conditions throughout the 1940s, and most disturbing, a series of disappearances in the months before the mill closed. 5 workers who were never found. One article mentioned a peculiar detail thread had been discovered at the scene of each disappearance, arranged in intricate patterns that investigators couldn't explain. The mill's owner dismissed these incidents as elaborate resignation notices, claiming the workers had simply left for better opportunities. That afternoon, I drove to the local history museum. The elderly curator seemed surprised by my interest in the mill, but directed me to a small display of artifacts, photographs, ledgers, and a sample of fabric produced there as I examined a black and white photo of workers posed before the main entrance. The curator mentioned casually that some old-timers believed the mill was haunted. According to local legend, the building's original architect had incorporated strange symbols into its design. Symbols meant to CH energy from the workers into the fabric they produced. Some claimed these symbols came from a book the architect had discovered during his travels in Eastern Europe. Others said he'd invented them himself after a nervous breakdown. The curator laughed as he shared these stories, clearly considering them nothing more than colorful local folklore. But as I stared at the photograph, a chill ran through me in the third-floor window, the same window where I'd seen the light. A blurred figure stood watching, indistinct yet undeniably present, and around the mill's foundation, barely visible in the photograph's faded edges. Thin lines formed a pattern identical to the one I'd seen on the tapestry. I haven't run past the mill since that night. I've changed my route permanently, even moved to an apartment in another part of town, but sometimes in the twilight. Between waking and sleep, I hear the distant sound of looms, and in my dreams I see that figure of woven thread, patiently crafting a tapestry in which I feature with increasing prominence. Yesterday I found a single thread on my pillow, blue-green. Faintly luminescent in the darkness, I told myself it was a stray fiber from a new shirt or towel, but I know better. The Westbrook Mill is reaching out, weaving me into its pattern, one strand at a time. I understand now what happened to those missing workers. They weren't fired or resigned. They were incorporated thread by living thread into something larger than themselves, something still growing, still creating, still watching from those black windows. Tonight I will drive past the mill, keeping my distance, watching for lights in those upper windows. I need to know if it's still there, still waiting. I won't get out of the car. I promise myself this every time. Even as I feel the pull growing stronger, the pattern of my life gradually altering to bring me back to those rusted gates. The watcher of the loom is patient. It has waited decades. It can wait a little longer for me. The first time I saw movement in the abandoned store next door, I convinced myself it was just the reflection of passing headlights on dirty glass. The second time I blamed it on exhaustion after a 14-hour workday. By the third time, I couldn't ignore the cold reality anymore. Something existed in that empty space, something that shouldn't be there, something that seemed to be watching me more intently. With each passing night, my name is Daniel Mercer, and 6 months ago I signed a 3-year release on what I thought was the perfect location for my print shop. The rent was surprisingly affordable for a storefront on Blackwell Avenue, a relatively busy commercial strip on the east side of town. The landlord, a nervous man with perpetually damp palms, mentioned something about the previous tenant leaving abruptly, but I was too excited about the prospect of finally owning my own business to press for details. He practically rushed me through the signing process, his pen trembling slightly as I initialed each page. The space to my right housed a thriving cafe that brought in steady foot traffic throughout the day, but to my left sat a vacant storefront that had once been a small electronics repair shop. According to the neighboring businesses, the owner had simply disappeared one day, leaving everything behind. Dusty shelves, outdated posters, even a half-empty coffee mug still sitting on the counter. The space had remained empty for nearly 8 months. By the time I moved in during daylight hours, there was nothing particularly unsettling about the abandoned store. It was just another failed business, a common enough sight in our struggling local economy. The faded close sign hung perpetually in the window, partially obscured by a layer of grime that had accumulated on the glass. Sun-bleached posters advertising services and products from months ago still clung to the windows, their edges curling inward like withered fingers. But as dusk settled and shadows lengthened across Blackwell Avenue, the vacant store underwent a subtle transformation. What appeared merely abandoned in daylight became something else entirely. After hours, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Whenever I locked up for the night, the first incident occurred. About 2 months after I opened my shop, I was working late, finishing a rush order that needed to be delivered the following morning. By the time I finished, it was well past 9 as I switched off the lights and prepared to leave. Through the rear entrance, a flash of movement caught my eye through the wall of windows facing the street. I turned, expecting to see a pedestrian or perhaps a stray cat. Instead, my gaze landed on the darkened interior of the vacant store next door for just a moment. So brief, I nearly convinced myself I'd imagined it. I saw a faint glow moving across the back wall, like someone walking with a phone screen illuminated. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the darkness, straining to see anything further, but the light, if it had ever existed, was gone. I stood frozen for several minutes, eyes fixed on the empty store, before finally gathering the courage to leave. As I walked to my car, a shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more strange occurrences. Twice, I spotted what looked like flashlight beams dancing across the ceiling of the vacant space as I locked up. Once I could have sworn I heard muffled thumping coming through the wall. We shared each time I considered calling the police to report a possible break-in, but something held me back. Perhaps the complete absence of any signs of forced entry, or maybe something deeper, an instinctive fear of what they might find inside, or worse, what they might not find. I began asking around about the previous tenant, a man named Howard Keller. The owner of the cafe next door described him as odd but harmless, a middle-aged loner who rarely spoke to anyone except to discuss repairs. The barber across the street mentioned that Howard had become increasingly paranoid in the weeks before his disappearance, constantly checking the corners of his store and installing additional locks on both his front and back doors. Said he kept hearing things moving around at night. The barber told me with a shrug, thought someone was breaking in after hours, but nothing was ever missing. According to him, just moved like someone was rearranging his store while he was gone. My hands grew clammy as he spoke. My mouth suddenly dry, I thanked him and left quickly, uncomfortably aware of the thin wall separating my livelihood from the empty space next door. One night in late October, I was working later than usual on quarterly tax filings. The street outside had grown quiet, most businesses having closed hours earlier. The only sounds were the soft hum of my computer and the occasional car passing on Blackwell Avenue. Just as I was about to shut down my system, a loud thud resonated through the wall. I froze fingers hovering over the keyboard. It had come from the vacant store. No question about it. The sound was solid and definitive, like a heavy object hitting the floor. My pulse quickened as I rose from my chair legs, strangely unsteady beneath me. Common sense argued that I should leave immediately, drive away, perhaps call the police from the safety of my car. But a darker curiosity propelled me toward the front of my shop, toward the windows that would allow me to peer into the neighboring space. The streetlights cast just enough illumination for me to make out the vague shapes of abandoned shelving units and display cases within. I pressed my face against the cool glass of my own storefront, angling to see as much of the adjacent interior as possible. The dusty windows of the vacant store revealed nothing at first, just shadows upon shadows in varying degrees of darkness. Then something moved. It wasn't dramatic. No lurching figure or obvious human shape, just a subtle shift in the darkness near the back corner. A patch of shadow that seemed denser than those surrounding it, moving with purpose rather than being stirred by air currents or passing headlights. My breath fogged the glass as I stared, heart hammering against my ribs. With such force I feared it might bruise the shadow. Paused as if sensing my observation, then gradually elongated up the wall. It stretched impossibly tall, reaching nearly to the ceiling before stopping again. Sweat bead on my forehead and upper lip. Despite the autumn chill, I wanted to look away to run to my car and never return, but I remained transfixed, unable to tear my gaze from the unnatural darkness that seemed to be watching me in return for felt like hours, but must have been only seconds. We remained locked in this silent standoff, me breathing in short, shallow gasps and the shadow perfectly still, except for subtle undulations around its edges like smoke caught in a gentle current. Then it retreated, sliding back down the wall and across the floor with fluid, almost liquid movements until it disappeared behind a counter at the rear of the store. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 20 seconds, but it fundamentally altered something within in me. Whatever existed in that space wasn't human, at least not entirely. I called Inc. the following day, unable to face returning to my shop. Instead, I spent hours researching the history of the building online, scrolling through local news archives and property records. The structure dated back to the 1800s, 1930s, originally housing a series of small retail establishments. Nothing in its documented history suggested tragedy or violence that might explain a haunting. Then I found a small article from 18 months earlier about Howard Keller filing multiple police reports regarding break-ins at his shop despite nothing ever being stolen. The final report mentioned Howard's increasing distress over sounds in the walls and his conviction that someone or something was living in the narrow crawl space between the two storefronts. My blood ran cold as I recalled the layout of the building. There was indeed a maintenance act access point in my back storage room, a narrow door that I had assumed led to electrical panels. I had never opened it. Having no reason to do so now, I wondered what might lurk beyond that innocuous door in the darkness between our walls. When I finally returned to work 2 days later, I couldn't focus. My eyes constantly drifted to the wall we shared with the vacant store. Was it my imagination, or could I hear faint scratching sounds emanating from within? I found myself holding my breath, straining to listen. During lulls in customer traffic, that night I stayed late again, though not by choice. Something compelled me to remain a morbid fascination with what might occur once darkness fell. I positioned myself at my desk, angled to keep the shared wall in my peripheral vision at all times. At first, nothing happened. The usual sounds of a settling building, creaks and groans as temperatures dropped were the only interruptions to the silence. Then just past 8, a soft tap-tap-tap began. It was rhythmic, almost purposeful, like knuckles gently rapping against the opposite side of the drywall. My mouth went dry as the tapping continued, moving horizontally along the wall as if tracing a path toward my back storage room. I rose on trembling legs and followed parallel to the sound, maintaining a safe distance while tracking its progress. The tapping stopped at the point where I knew the maintenance door stood on my side. For several heartbeats, silence reigned. Then came a sound that sent ice through my veins, the distinct metallic click of a latch being tested from the other side. I backed away, knocking over a display of brochures in my haste. The rustling of falling papers seemed obscenely loud in the quiet shop. The clicking at the door ceased immediately. They had heard me. I fled then, not bothering to shut down my computer or turn off lights in the safety of my locked car hands, shaking too badly to insert the key into the ignition. On the first 3 attempts, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what I had been sensing all along. Whatever occupied the vacant store was aware of me, had been watching me, and was now trying to find a way through. Sleep evaded me that night. I lay awake in my apartment, miles from Blackwell Avenue, yet feeling the entity's presence as if it had followed me home in those dark hours before dawn. My rational mind attempted to reassert control. Perhaps it was just homeless individuals who had found a way into the abandoned shop. Maybe Howard Keller himself had returned living secretly in his former business. These explanations felt hollow, insufficient to explain the unnatural movement of that shadow, or the coldness that permeated the air whenever I sensed its attention. The next morning I arrived earlier than usual, unlocking my shop just as the first hints of daylight crept across the horizon. With determined steps, I marched directly to the back storage room and flung open the maintenance door. I had so studiously avoided it revealed exactly what it should have: a narrow utility space, housing electrical panels, water meters, and heating ducts. Relief washed over me until my flashlight beam illuminated the far wall. There, scratched into the plaster in jagged, desperate strokes, was a message. It lives in the space of between. Below these words were dozens of tally marks, as if someone had been counting days or possibly visits from whatever they feared. The scratches appeared old, covered in a layer of dust that spoke of months rather than days. I slammed the door shut and wedged a heavy filing cabinet in front of it. For 2 weeks, I adjusted my schedule, opening later and closing earlier to avoid being alone in the shop during twilight hours. I hired a part-time assistant, partly for the help, but mostly so I wouldn't be alone. The strange occurrences seemed to subside, or perhaps they simply weren't visible. During the shortened hours I now kept, then came the night I forgot an important client contract on my desk. I had already arrived home when I realized my error and the documents needed to be reviewed. Before a morning meeting, with great reluctance, I drove back to Blackwell Avenue just before 10 o'clock. The street was deserted, storefront dark, except for security lights that cast weak pools of illumination at irregular intervals. I parked directly in front of my shop, leaving the headlights on, and aimed at my entrance, a childish attempt to keep shadows at bay as I approached my door key and hand movement. In the vacant store caught my eye. This time there was no mistaking it. A tall, thin silhouette glided past the front windows, visible for just a moment before disappearing into the deeper darkness. Within, my fingers trembled so violently that I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. Once inside, I moved with desperate haste, snatching the contract folder from my desk without even checking its contents as I turned to leave. The lights in my shop flickered once, twice, then stabilized, and that's when I heard it. A soft shuffling coming from the storage room. The filing cabinet I had placed in front of the maintenance door had been moved aside just enough to allow the door to open a few inches from within. That narrow gap came a faint luminescence, not the warm yellow of incandescent light or the cool blue of LED, but something sickly and green, pulsing gently like a diseased heartbeat. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The shuffling stopped for several seconds. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then a response not in words, but in a long-sustained sigh that contained neither any relief nor frustration, but something closer to hunger. I backed toward the front door, unwilling to turn my back on whatever waited in the storage room. The green light began to intensify, growing brighter as a shadow stretched out from the partially open door, reaching across the floor toward me with impossible length. My back hit the front entrance. I fumbled behind me for the handle eyes still fixed on the advancing darkness, just as my fingers closed around the cold metal. The shadow reared up from the floor, rising into a column that towered nearly to the ceiling. It began to take shape, vaguely humanoid, but wrong in fundamental ways. Limbs too long and jointed in places where human arms and legs should not bend, a head that seemed more suggestion than substance, tilting at an angle that implied curiosity or perhaps assessment. The contract slipped from my nerveless fingers as the figure took one gliding step forward, then another. Its movement was silent now, eerily graceful as it emerged fully from the storage room in that moment of pure terror. A strange clarity descended upon me. I realized that what stood before me was neither ghost nor monster in the traditional sense. It was something that existed in the negative spaces of our reality, in the gaps between walls and the shadows between streetlights, in the silence between heartbeats. Howard Keller hadn't fled. He had been absorbed, becoming part of the entity that had tormented him. The same entity that now reached for me with elongated fingers that seemed to both exist and not exist simultaneously. I burst through the front door, not bothering to lock it behind me as I threw myself into my car and peeled away from the curb. I glanced in my rearview mirror. There, framed perfectly in the doorway of my shop, stood the figure now fully solid and unmistakably wearing what appeared to be Howard Keller's face, stretched over features that were decidedly not human. I never returned to collect my belongings. I called the landlord the next day and told him I was breaking my lease, willing to forfeit my security deposit and pay whatever penalties were necessary. His lack of surprise spoke volumes. "It happens," he said quietly. "Every few tenants, they never stay long once it notices them." I've moved across the country since then, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Blackwell Avenue, but sometimes in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, I sense a familiar presence in the corner of my bedroom where shadows gather most densely. I occasionally glimpse movement, a subtle shifting that shouldn't be possible in an empty space. And on those nights I lie perfectly still, eyes shut tight, knowing with dreadful certainty that some things, once they notice you, never truly let you go. They merely bide their time in the spaces between, waiting for the moment when you too will become another shadow on the wall, the fluorescent. Lights never flicker in our office. That's what makes it worse. There's no warning, no physical manifestation of the wrongness that permeates this place. Just the steady clinical brightness washing over identical beige partitions, creating the illusion of normalcy while something watches from the peripheral edges of perception. I've worked at Meridian Financial for 3 years now, and it wasn't until 6 weeks ago that I began to question whether I was truly alone at my desk. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. The office had emptied for lunch, but I'd stayed behind to finish a quarterly report. The building was unusually quiet, without the ambient noise of fingers tapping keyboards and hushed conversations flowing over partition walls. I was deep in concentration, manipulating data points in an Excel spreadsheet when I felt it. My chair slowly rolling backward, not a sudden jerk, but a deliberate measured pull, as though someone standing behind me had grasped the backrest with both hands and gently drawn it away from my desk. My body tensed immediately. The movement was unmistakable, the roller wheels making that distinctive soft rumble against the thin carpet. I spun around, expecting to find a coworker playing a prank, but encountered only the empty space between my cubicle and the wall. The air conditioning vent was 15 feet away, its gentle breeze far too weak to move a chair occupied by my 185-pound frame. I scanned the area for any logical explanation. Perhaps the floor was uneven, causing a gradual roll. Nothing. The floor was perfectly level. The chair's wheels were locked. There was no rational explanation for what had just occurred after a few moments of staring into empty space. I laughed nervously and rolled myself back to my desk. The sound echoed unnaturally in the vacant office. I dismissed the incident, blaming it on lack of sleep or an overactive imagination fueled by too much caffeine, but that was just the beginning. 2 days later, I was organizing files in the cabinet adjacent to Kyle Peterson's desk when I heard it. The distinctive click of a mouse button being depressed, then released. I straightened up my spine, stiffening as I turned toward the sound. Kyle's workstation sat empty, his computer powered down the monitor, a black void reflecting the overhead lights as I stared. Another click pierced the silence, then unmistakably the rapid tapping of keys on a keyboard that shouldn't have been active. The hairs on my forearm stood up as I approached Kyle's desk. The phantom typing continued for 3 more seconds before abruptly ceasing. When I reached the edge of his partition, the keyboard sat undisturbed. The mouse hadn't moved, the computer remained off its power button. Unlit, I pressed a random key experimentally, feeling the familiar resistance and hearing the plastic click. It sounded identical to what I just heard, except there had been no one there to press it. I reported the incident to it the next morning, keeping my voice casual as I described strange electrical activity at several workstations. Maris from tech support conducted a thorough inspection, checking for short circuits, software glitches, and remote access attempts. His analysis revealed nothing unusual. He suggested that newer computers sometimes made settling noises as components cooled. Although his explanation seemed forced, a rational band-aid applied to an irrational wound. The incident escalated over the following week. I began documenting each occurrence in a password-protected file on my desktop titled Office Anomalies. The mouse clicks and phantom typing continued intermittently, always from unmanned workstations. Twice I discovered my own monitors awake when returning from short breaks. Despite having manually put them to sleep, chair movements became more frequent. Not just my own chair rolling backward, but occasionally shifting to the side in tiny increments, as though someone invisible was adjusting their position for comfort. I started noticing patterns. The phenomena occurred most frequently between 2:30 and 4:15 p.m., when the office population thinned as people attended meetings or took late coffee breaks. Activity clustered around my section of the floor and 3 empty cubicles nearby that had been vacant since the last round of layoffs. The temperature around these workstations ran consistently 3 to 4 degrees cooler than the rest of the office. According to the small digital thermometer I'd smuggled in and placed discreetly on my desk, my colleagues noticed the change in my behavior before they noticed anything unusual about the office itself. I caught Diane from accounting watching me with concern when I abruptly stopped mid-sentence during our budget meeting after hearing keyboard clicks from an empty conference room next door. Later, she quietly asked if everything was all right at home, her eyes communicating a sympathy I didn't want or need. I assured her I was fine, just suffering from insomnia, the standard excuse for increasingly erratic behavior. The truth was, I'd begun dreading coming to work each morning. I would stand at the entrance to my cubicle, heart pounding, palms slick with sweat, scanning my workspace for signs of disturbance. Had my chair moved a quarter inch to the left, was my monitor tilted at a slightly different angle? Were my pens arranged exactly as I'd left them? The minute adjustments seemed deliberate, as though someone wanted me to notice them but couldn't physically move objects more dramatically. By the 3rd week, I developed a routine to document the normal state of my workspace before leaving it unattended. I took photos with my phone before bathroom breaks, positioned items in specific alignments, and even placed a single strand of hair across my keyboard, an old spy trick to detect interference. More often than not, I would return to find subtle changes. The hair moved or missing. My stapler rotated 15 degrees. Desktop icons rearranged. The incident that finally shattered my skepticism occurred exactly 32 days after the first chair movement. I'd stepped away from my desk for barely 3 minutes to refill my coffee mug. When I returned, my computer display showed an open Word document I had no recollection of creating. The file name was a string of numbers 2222317 docs that I later realized corresponded to the date of the first incident. The document contained only a single line of text typed in 12-point Arial. I need to finish what was started. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers, the ceramic shattering against the thin industrial carpet, hot liquid spattering my ankles. I barely felt it. The words on the screen seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. I didn't create this file. No one else had access to my computer, which automatically locked after 60 seconds of inactivity. Yet here it was undeniable evidence that something or someone was using my workstation. My mouth went dry as I lowered myself into my chair, which felt unusually cold against my back, as though someone had just vacated it with trembling fingers. I closed the document without saving and ran a full virus scan. The system came back clean. I checked the document properties, which listed me as the author and showed a creation time of 10:37 a.m., exactly when I'd been standing in the break room watching coffee drip into my mug from the machine spout that night I couldn't sleep. My mind raced through possible explanations, each more unlikely than the last. An elaborate prank by coworkers, corporate espionage, a security guard. With access to our systems during off hours, a homeless person somehow gaining entry to the building. None of it made sense. The building had 24-hour security and keycard access. The IT systems logged all activity. There would be evidence of an intruder unless the intruder wasn't physical. The thought that had been hovering at the edges of my consciousness finally formed into coherent shape. What if the empty cubicles weren't actually empty? I began researching the history of our office building, digging through public records and news archives during lunch breaks and sleepless nights. The 12-story structure had been built in the late 1980s on land previously occupied by a small psychiatric outpatient facility. Nothing particularly sinister emerged from my investigation. No mass casualties, no suspicious deaths, no documented paranormal incidents. The building had changed hands several times before Meridian Financial leased 3 floors. 5 years ago, however, one detail caught my attention. A small news item from 4 years back mentioned an employee of the previous tenant, an insurance company who had disappeared after being laid off. Walter Grimm, age 47, had reportedly become distraught. After losing his job of 15 years, his car was found in the parking garage, but Walter himself was never located. The article was brief, mentioning that police suspected suicide, though no body was ever recovered. A follow-up piece 3 months later indicated the case had gone cold. My pulse quickened when I read the physical description of Walter Grimm, 5'10", 190 pounds. About my build, the article included a grainy photo showing a nondescript middle-aged man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, similar to the ones I wore. The resemblance wasn't striking, but it was enough to send a chill racing down my spine. I began noticing new patterns in the phenomena. Activity intensified whenever I worked late. As though my presence after hours disrupted something, the phantom typing became more urgent, the chair movements more aggressive twice. I felt a distinct pressure against my shoulder blades while working, as though someone were leaning over me to view my monitor. Each time I'd spin around to find empty air, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. My work performance suffered. I missed deadlines, made careless errors in financial projections, and zoned out during important meetings. My supervisor, Michael, called me into his office to express concern. He spoke in carefully measured tones about a stress management and the company's employee assistance program. I nodded mechanically, knowing there was no way to explain what was happening without sounding completely unhinged. I promised to improve and left his office with a referral to a therapist I had no intention of seeing. Instead, I formulated a plan. If something was occupying my workspace when I wasn't there, I needed to document it. I purchased a small motion-activated camera disguised as a phone charger and positioned it on my desk, angled to capture my chair and computer. For 3 days, I reviewed the footage each night, finding nothing but the occasional colleague walking past my cubicle. The disappointment was almost worse than confirmation would have been. Was I truly losing my mind on the 4th day? The camera failed to record anything at all. When I checked the device, I found it unplugged, the memory card missing. I searched my entire cubicle, growing increasingly frantic as I removed stacks of papers and empty drawers. The memory card was nowhere to be found. My hands trembled as I realized the implications. Whatever was happening, it was aware of my attempts to document it. That same afternoon, I received an email from an internal address I didn't recognize. RimmerMeridianFinancial.com. The subject line read your replacement, and the body contained only 2 words. Almost ready, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Walter Grimm, the disappeared employee. I checked our company directory. No listing for anyone with that surname. I forwarded the email to it. Security claiming it looked suspicious within an hour. Marcus appeared at my cubicle. His expression troubled. That email address doesn't exist in our system, he said, keeping his voice low, and there's no record of this message in the server logs. Are you sure you received it? I showed him my inbox, the message still prominently displayed. He squinted at my screen, then asked if he could check something. I relinquished my chair, watching as he opened command prompt and typed a series of instructions. His frown deepened. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. According to the logs, you sent an email to yourself at 2:43 p.m., but the sender address has been modified somehow. This shouldn't be possible without admin access. I didn't send anything to myself. I insisted. My voice, rising several heads, turned in our direction. Marcus gave me a look that mixed confusion with pity. Look, maybe you should take a few days off. I can report this as a system glitch. But he trailed off, glancing at my desk, which I now realized was cluttered with disorganized papers, empty coffee cups, and the scattered components of my disassembled spy camera. I followed his gaze and saw my workspace through his eyes, the domain of someone unraveling. I agreed to take time off, not because I accepted his unspoken assessment of my mental state, but because I needed time to think. Without the constant fear of what might happen when I turned my back as I packed my bag, I felt a strange reluctance emanating from the space around me, as though the air itself had thickened with disapproval. For a moment, I could have sworn I heard breathing behind me, not my own irregular, panicked breaths, but the measured inhalations of someone watching and waiting. 3 days at home did nothing to calm my nerves. I slept poorly, jolting awake at the slightest noise, convinced I'd heard keyboard clicks or rolling chair. Wheels on the hardwood floors of my apartment during waking hours. I obsessively researched Walter Grimm, building a profile of the man who might be haunting my workstation. His digital footprint was minimal. No social media accounts, just a few mentions in company newsletter letters from his former employer. One photo showed him at his desk, occupying what I now realized was the exact location of my current cubicle. When I returned to work the following Monday, I found my workspace meticulously organized. My pens were aligned perfectly parallel to my keyboard. My monitors were positioned at precisely the same height and angle. Even my chair was adjusted to the optimal ergonomic position. Nothing was missing or added. Everything was simply optimized, as though someone had been fine-tuning my workspace. In my absence, my colleagues welcomed me back with awkward smiles and careful questions about how I was feeling. I responded with practiced reassurances, claiming a stomach virus had kept me home. As the day progressed, I maintained a facade of normalcy while hyper-aware of every sound and movement around me. Nothing unusual occurred, no phantom typing, no moving chairs, no unexplained emails. The absence of phenomena was more unsettling than their presence had been. As the office emptied for the day, I made a deliberate decision to work late. I needed to confront whatever was happening, to face it directly rather than allowing fear to consume me at 6:30 p.m. I was alone on the floor, the overhead lights dimmed to their energy-saving evening setting. Casting longer shadows between cubicle partitions, I stood up from my chair and spoke aloud to the empty office. Walter Grimm. I know you're here. The words hung in the air, seeming to vibrate in the silence that followed for nearly a minute. Nothing happened then. Slowly, deliberately, my chair swiveled 180 degrees to face me. The seat remained empty, but the impression of weight was unmistakable. the cushion compressed slightly as though supporting an invisible occupant. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I feared it might rupture. Sweat beaded on my forehead and trickled down my temples as I stared at the vacant chair that somehow communicated absolute presence. A window opened on my computer monitor notepad, white text cursor blinking against the blank document. Then character by character words appeared. They replaced me. They'll replace you too. We're all temporary here. My legs threatened to buckle beneath me. I gripped the edge of the neighboring desk for support, my knuckles whitening with the effort to remain standing. The typing continued. I didn't leave. I'm still working. I need to finish what was started, but they gave my desk to you. You look like me, sound like me, taking my place. My place. The final two words appeared in capitals, the keys striking with such force that the entire keyboard visibly depressed with each letter. I found my voice, though it emerged as little more than a hoarse whisper. I didn't know. I didn't take anything from you. The cursor blinked for several seconds before new text appeared, more measured now. Not your fault. Management decision, downsizing, optimization, human resources. Human resources, like we're just things to be used until we're used up. I swallowed hard, my throat clicking dryly. What do you want from me? The recipe response came immediately. Acknowledgement, recognition. I still exist. I still matter. I still work. A chill washed over me as understanding dawned. Walter Grimm hadn't left the building after being laid off. Something had happened here, something he couldn't or wouldn't leave behind. His presence had lingered, performing the routines that had defined his existence for 15 years, and when I had been assigned his former cubicle, his territory, his purpose had shifted from performing work to reclaiming his space with trembling fingers. I typed a response. I acknowledge you, Walter. Your work was important. You still matter. For a long moment. Nothing happened. Then my chair slowly rolled backward, creating space at the desk. New text appeared on the screen. There's room for both of us. I can help. I never make mistakes in spreadsheets, never miss deadlines. I just need somewhere to work. I stared at the monitor, understanding the implicit offer, a partnership with something that wasn't supposed to exist, an arrangement that defied rational explanation. Yet in that moment it seemed less frightening than it should have. Perhaps because I finally understood Walter Grimm wasn't malevolent. He was just another office worker clinging to the only identity he had known, unwilling or unable to accept his termination. We can share, I said softly, the words. Feeling strange in my mouth. You work after hours. I work during the day, but no more. Moving my things or scaring me. The cursor blinked for several seconds before the final message appeared. Acceptable terms, contract agreed. Thank you for not replacing me completely. The text document closed itself. My chair rolled forward slightly, then stopped as though inviting me to reclaim my position. With a deep breath, I sat down, feeling a strange pocket of cold air that dissipated as I settled into the seat. The office felt different now, not exactly safe, but comprehensible in a way it hadn't been before. That was 6 months ago. I still work at Meridian Financial. Still occupy the same cubicle. My productivity has mysteriously improved. Spreadsheets that would have taken me hours somehow get completed overnight. My error rate has dropped to 0. My supervisor has commented on my remarkable turnaround, even putting me up for promotion. I never stay past 6 p.m. Now that's Walter's time each morning when I arrive. My desk is immaculately organized. My files arranged with mathematical precision, my chair adjusted to perfect ergonomic height. Sometimes I find notes in minimized windows, suggestions for approaching difficult projects, observations about office politics, warning about upcoming policy changes that somehow materialize days later. I've stopped questioning how he knows these things or what exactly Walter Grimm is now. I simply accept that my workspace has 2 occupants working in shifts we never overlap, except for those brief moments when I'm gathering my things to leave and the air grows slightly colder around me. I always say goodbye aloud, acknowledging his presence before departing. I've learned to live with the arrangement. This strange symbiosis with whatever remains of the man who worked here before me, but some nights lying awake in my apartment, I wonder what would happen if I were ever downsized. Myself, would I leave peacefully, or would something essential remain behind typing at a keyboard long after my body had gone? And if someone new were assigned to my cubicle, our cubicle, would there be room for three? I try not to think about it. Instead, I focus on being replaceable after all. In today's economy, job security is everything, and having seen the alternative, I'm more motivated than ever to keep my position. Because now I understand the truth that Walter Grimm discovered at Meridian Financial. No one ever really leaves their desk EO. The fluorescent light above my head flickered once, twice, then settled into a persistent, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to drill directly into my skull. A cold draft crawled across the back of my neck, raising goosebumps on my skin. Despite the supposedly climate-controlled environment of the university's sub-basement archives, I told myself it was just poor ventilation. Old buildings have their quirks after all. But deep down in that primitive part of my brain that ancestors relied on for survival, something whispered, "You are not alone down here." My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm an adjunct professor of American literature at Grayson University, and 3 months ago I discovered the perfect hiding place. The sub-basement archives, a labyrinth of metal shelving units filled with dusty tomes, forgotten journals, and boxed records that hadn't seen daylight in decades, became my sanctuary. Unlike the crowded faculty offices or the perpetually noisy library, no one came down here. The isolation was perfect for someone like me, desperate for uninterrupted research time to finish the book that might finally secure me a tenure-track position. At first I found the silence comforting, the gentle hiss of the ancient ventilation system, the occasional creak of the building settling. They became a soothing white noise. As I worked, I established a routine, arriving early each morning with a thermos of coffee, navigating the narrow passages between shelves to my favorite corner, where I'd set up a makeshift workspace atop an old wooden desk. The first incident happened on a Tuesday, exactly 26 days after I began working in the archives. I was deep into my research when the sensation hit me, a subtle shift in air pressure, as if someone had just walked past my coffee cup, trembled slightly, sending ripples across the dark surface of the liquid. I looked up, expecting to see a janitor or perhaps another faculty member who had discovered my hiding spot. No one was there. I returned to my notes, attributing the disturbance to the building's old bones, but then it came a sound so faint that had the archives not been deathly quiet, I would have missed it entirely. Daniel, my name, whispered in a voice that seemed neither male nor female, neither old nor young, just a breath of sound that slithered through the stacks. I jerked upright, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly unsteady. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me. I rose from my chair, the metal legs scraping against the concrete floor with an ugly screech that echoed through the archives. Tentatively, I moved toward where I thought the sound had originated, a dark corner where multiple rows of shelving converged. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, my body instinctively resistant to approaching the source. When I reached the corner, I found nothing but dust and forgotten books. The air was still undisturbed. I laughed nervously at my own foolishness, running my fingers through my hair and willing my pulse to slow. Old buildings make noises. Everyone knows that I returned to my desk, but concentration eluded me. My eyes kept darting to the shadowy spaces between shelves, and more than once I caught myself holding my breath. Straining to hear something, anything after an hour of diminishing productivity, I packed up my materials and left, resolving to return the next day with a clearer head sleep. Came fitfully that night, I dreamed of narrow corridors that stretched endlessly before me, of books whose pages turned on their own, of whispers that grew in volume but remained maddeningly unintelligible. I woke repeatedly, sheets damp with sweat, certain I'd heard my name called from the darkest corner of my bedroom. Despite my unease, I returned to the archives the following morning. My career depended on this research, and I refused to be chased away by what was clearly an overactive imagination fueled by too much caffeine and academic pressure. The archives welcomed me with their familiar musty scent and Tom-like silence. I settled at my desk, determined to make progress for several hours. Nothing disturbed me save the occasional flicker of the overhead lights, a common occurrence in the sub-basement. Then, as afternoon crept toward evening, it happened again. "You shouldn't be here." "Daniel." The whisper came from directly behind me this time, so close I could have sworn I felt breath against my ear. I spun around violently, nearly toppling my chair in the process. My heart seized in my chest. The sudden surge of adrenaline making my vision sharpen painfully. No one was there, nothing but rows of silent shelves stretching back into the dimness. "This isn't funny," I said aloud, my voice sounding pathetically small in the vast space. If someone's playing a joke, it's not working. I knew even as I spoke that no one was there to hear me. The sub-basement had only one entrance, and I would have seen anyone coming or going. The logical part of my brain insisted there was a rational explanation. Perhaps the ventilation system carrying sounds from elsewhere in the building, or my own exhausted mind playing tricks on me. But the primitive part, the part that recognized danger before conscious thought could process it, was screaming at me to leave. I ignored it. I had deadlines to meet, a career to salvage. Instead, I took to bringing a small digital recorder with me, determined to capture evidence of whatever was happening. If it was a prank, I'd identify the culprit. If it was some quirk of acoustics, I'd document it. And if it was something else entirely, well, I wasn't ready to consider that possibility for a week. Nothing happened. The archives remained silent save for my own movements and the building's ambient noises. The digital recorder captured nothing unusual. I began to relax, convincing myself that stress had momentarily gotten the better of me. Then came the day everything changed. I arrived earlier than usual, determined to make substantial progress on a particularly challenging chapter. The archives seemed different, somehow colder, perhaps, or simply more oppressive. The lights overhead buzzed more aggressively, and several flickered with greater frequency than normal. As I wound my way through the shelves toward my workspace, I noticed something odd. Several books protruding from their usual neat alignment as if hastily replaced. I frowned, certain I hadn't left them that way. No one else had access to this section. These were my research materials, carefully organized according to my own system. I approached the shelf. My footsteps suddenly loud in my ears. With a trembling hand, I reached out to straighten the misaligned volumes. "Don't touch what isn't yours, Daniel." The whisper came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the space around me like a sudden drop in air pressure. My ears popped painfully, and for an instant I couldn't breathe, as if all oxygen had been sucked from the room. I stumbled backward, crashing into the shelf behind me. Several heavy tomes tumbled to the floor with thunderous impacts. Sweat beaded instantly across my forehead and upper lip, cold and clammy. My mouth went dry, my tongue sticking to the roof as I tried to call out. When I finally found my voice, it emerged as little more than a croak. "Who's there? Show yourself, self." The lights overhead flickered violently, then steadied in the momentary darkness. I could have sworn I saw a figure at the end of the row, tall, indistinct, motionless. But when the light stabilized, nothing was there. My hand shook as I activated the digital recorder, holding it before me like a talisman. "If someone is here," I said, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in my voice, "identify yourself immediately. This area is restricted." When I played back the recording later, there was no trace of my voice, only a persistent static punctuated by what sounded like distant, muffled weeping. I should have left. Then I should have reported the incident to campus security, or at least to my department head. Instead, fueled by a toxic mixture of academic desperation and morbid curiosity, I became obsessed with documenting the phenomena. I began spending even more time in the archives, arriving earlier and staying later. I set up additional recorders throughout the space. I took detailed notes of every unusual occurrence, the temperature drops, the light fluctuations, the whispers that grew increasingly frequent and increasingly specific. "They won't believe you." "Daniel, you're not supposed to see Daniel." "Some knowledge should stay buried." "Daniel, my colleagues noticed the change in me during a department meeting. Professor Hargrove pulled me aside to ask if everything was all right." I looked unwell. she said with a concerned expression that didn't quite mask her discomfort. Had I been sleeping? Was I eating properly? Perhaps I should consider taking some time off. I responded with assurances that I was fine, just deeply engaged in my research. The words sounded hollow even to my own ears. The truth was, I barely recognized myself anymore. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a gaunt face with shadowed eyes that darted nervously at each flicker of the fluorescent lights. I had lost weight, my clothes hung loosely on my frame. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought dreams of endless corridors and whispers that built to screams before I jerked awake, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. But I couldn't stop. Something in the archives had singled me out, and I was determined to understand why the breakthrough came on a Friday, section break. Evening. As twilight painted the few high windows of the sub-basement with dying light, I had been combing through an obscure collection of university records, hoping to find some history of the archives that might explain what was happening. A slim volume bound in cracked leather and unlabeled caught my attention. It had been wedged between two larger books, almost as if someone had deliberately hidden it. The pages were brittle with age, covered in handwritten notes and a spidery script that took me several minutes to decipher. It was a journal dating back to the early days of the university's founding. The author, a professor of philosophy named Edward Grayson, a relative of the university's namesake, described his research into what he called the thinning of veils between worlds. Much of it read like the ravings of a man in the grip of delusion, but certain passages made my blood run cold. The subterranean chambers beneath the library serve as a natural convergence point, something about the geology perhaps, or some older purpose the land once served. I have conducted experiments that suggest the boundaries are weakest. Here, voices come through, sometimes more than voices, and later I have established communication. It knows me now, it speaks my name in the darkness. It shows me things, truths hidden from human understanding. I record everything, though I fear what might happen should these records fall into hands unprepared for such knowledge. The final entry, dated 1879, read simply, "God forgive me for what I've done." I thought I was recording its words. I realized now I was transcribing an invitation. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the journal. A cold sweat broke out across my body and my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, everything. The whispers, the sensations of being watched, the growing dread that had taken root in my psyche suddenly crystallized into horrible clarity. I wasn't experiencing random phenomena. I wasn't losing my mind. Something had been trying to communicate with me just as it had with Edward Grayson nearly 150 years ago. The realization brought a strange calm. I closed the journal and placed it carefully on my desk. I had to think, had to plan my next move carefully. If Grayson's records were accurate, I wasn't dealing with a ghost or some remnant of human consciousness, but something older, something that existed in a space adjacent to our reality. As I sat contemplating my discovery, the lights overhead began to flicker more violently than ever. Before the air temperature plummeted so rapidly that my next breath emerged as a cloud of vapor, the pressure in the room changed, causing my ears to pop. Painfully, "Finally understand, Daniel?" The whisper came from directly beside IDE me, so clear and distinct that it could have been a person standing at my shoulder. Been waiting so long for someone to listen again. I didn't turn, I couldn't. My muscles had locked, frozen in primal terror. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice a broken whisper, not what. Where came the reply, somehow conveying amusement despite its ethereal quality, nowhere, everywhere adjacent. Parallel, separated by a membrane grown thin in this place. What do you want from me? The same thing Edward wanted from me. Knowledge exchange. I showed him wonders. A cold sensation brushed against my hand like fingers made of ice water, attempting to intertwine with mine. I jerked away, finally breaking my paralysis. I stumbled to my feet, knocking over my chair in the process. "Don't fear me, Daniel. I've been patient, watched you work, admired your dedication. You seek tenure recognition. I can give you insights no human has ever possessed." The offer hung in the air, tempting in its simplicity academic success. The validation I'd been desperately pursuing for years dangled before me like forbidden fruit, and in exchange I asked already knowing the answer wouldn't be one I wanted to hear. Just permission. Daniel, just an invitation like Edward gave me a small tear in the veil. Just enough to share properly, the temperature dropped further, my breath emerged in great clouding. Puffs the overhead lights flickered rapidly now, creating a strobe effect that distorted my perception in the spaces between light and darkness. I thought I saw something taking shape, a suggestion of form that my eyes couldn't quite focus on, as if my brain refused to process what it was seeing. Grayson regretted it, I said. Backing slowly toward the exit, he asked forgiveness in his final entry, weakness. The voice hissed closer. Now he lacked vision. You don't have to repeat his mistake. Think of what we could accomplish together for one terrible moment. I hesitated. The promise of knowledge, of insights no other scholar possessed, was almost irresistible. My entire career, my identity was built around the pursuit of understanding what was academic research, if not an attempt to push back the boundaries of human knowledge. But something in the voice's eagerness gave me pause. Not Grayson's warning, not the inherent danger of the unknown, but simply the desperation underlying the entities. Offer whatever existed on the other side of that membrane wanted access desperately. 2. Desperately for its intentions to be benevolent. No, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. No, I don't think I will. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The temperature plummeted further, frost actually forming on the metal shelving around me. The lights exploded one after another, showering sparks and glass across the archives in the sudden darkness. I sensed movement, rapid, agitated, closing in from all sides. You can't leave. The whisper became a shriek, reverberating through the underground space with such force that several books tumbled from their shelves. I've waited too long, you were chosen. Panic seized me. I turned and ran, navigating the dark maze of shelving from memory, my hands outstretched to avoid collision behind me. I heard the crash of falling shelves, as if something large was knocking them over in pursuit. The air filled with the musty scent of ancient paper and something else, an alien that burned my nostrils and stung my eyes. I reached the stairs and took them 2 at a time, my lungs burning, my legs threatening to buckle. I could feel it behind me, a cold pressure pushing against the back of my neck. Fingers of ice just barely grazing my skin. Daniel, my name, echoed up the stairwell, distorted and stretched into something barely recognizable. You can't escape knowledge, once offered. I burst through the door at the top of the stairs, emerging into the brightly lit main floor of the library. Several startled students looked up from their studies as I staggered past, doubtlessly appearing like a madman, disheveled, wild-eyed, gasping for breath. I didn't stop running until I reached the campus security office. What followed was predictably disappointing. The security officers investigated the archives and found evidence of an electrical malfunction. The cause of the exploded lights they attributed to fallen shelves, to poor maintenance, and possibly my own panicked flight through the stacks when I tried to explain about the whispers. The journal, the entity that had offered me forbidden knowledge. I was met with concerned looks and gentle suggestions that perhaps I should speak with someone from the university's counseling center. I didn't argue. What could I say that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a man on the edge of a breakdown? The journal itself had vanished, whether taken by the entity or simply lost in the chaos of fallen shelves and scattered books. I couldn't say without it I had no evidence beyond my own increasingly uncertain recollections that was 2 weeks ago. I haven't returned to the archives. Since then, I've restricted my research to the main library, always ensuring I'm surrounded by other people. I've even begun seeing a therapist, exploring the possibility that academic pressure and isolation might have triggered some kind of psychological episode. But sometimes late at night in my apartment, when the heating system kicks on and air whistles through the vents, I think I hear it again, that familiar whisper saying my name with a familiarity that makes my skin crawl, Daniel. And sometimes just before I fall asleep, I wonder if I made the right choice. What knowledge waits on the other side of that thin membrane? What insights might I have gained? What price would I really have paid for academic immortality? Those thoughts terrify me far more than any supernatural encounter because, in my heart, I know the truth part of me wanted to say yes. Part of me still does. Yesterday, I received an email from the University Facilities Department informing all faculty that the sub-basement archives would be reopened. Following electrical repairs attached was the new access schedule and an invitation to resume any research activities that have been disrupted. I haven't deleted the email. I haven't responded either, but I keep thinking about that journal about Edward Grayson's final words, his plea for forgiveness. I keep thinking about the desperation in that ethereal voice, the promises it made, the knowledge it offered. And I find myself wondering as my cursor hovers over the reply button just how thin that membrane between worlds really is, and whether it might be worth taking one more trip down those stairs just to satisfy my curiosity. After all, what kind of scholar would I be if I didn't pursue knowledge regardless of where it might lead for?